The jackal was lying on the ground with his tongue out and breathing heavily. He didn't realize who had hit him so hard. His soul had almost left his body. The blow had been incredibly powerful. All the beasts that were under his control woke up from their sleep, and now looked at him with round eyes and did not understand anything. Suddenly, the monsters turned in the opposite direction, and frightenedly ran deep into the forest. Why are all the monsters running away? The guy stood there and didn't understand anything. It seems that after the headmaster lost consciousness, the magic that he had been controlling everyone immediately dissipated. The jackal stood up and rubbed his bruised head. Damn it, if he hadn't let his guard down, he wouldn't have regained his physical form. How careless. He was angry with himself. How could he have let such an unfortunate lapse happen? However, it wasn't over. As long as he used his strength, these two wouldn't be able to defeat him. He once again got into a fighting stance and began to accumulate combat power. The protagonist at this time didn't waste any time. He rushed straight at his enemy like a bullet holding a sword. His face darkened. He approached the jackal closer and closer. The monster did not have time to finish his sentence, but suddenly the blade of the sword pierced his throat. Blood splashed in different directions. The monster did not even have time to react to such a lightning-fast lunge. He wheezed and his eyes slowly began to fade away. Had he already forgotten? His strength wasn't as monstrous as he had imagined. The guy was standing behind him. He made such a quick strike that the monster didn't even have time to realize anything. Xian disdainfully looked at him. He seemed to have forgotten that his azulette sword technique and this monster's demonic power were sworn enemies. At this time, the principal, along with the rest of the teachers, were trying their best to destroy the dome. They were using their most powerful spells that were like lightning bolts to pierce into the dome. They braided it like a spider web, but the structure absorbed all the energy as if it was not damaging it at all. But suddenly something changed. The dome forbade it and it shattered like glass. The spell had worked after all. The principal shouted for everyone to block the entrances immediately, and also told all the teachers to go in immediately and help the students if they were inadvertently injured. The old man was incredibly serious at this point. It was as if he had undergone a transformation and was no longer that silly old man. He shouted for the teachers to save them at any cost. The others nodded in understanding and rushed forward. Soon, it was all over. A lot of students left the forest. Luckily, most of them survived. A small tent camp was set up near the dome with students who had just come out of the dome. They were receiving full medical attention. The kids were very scared that a bunch of students had died. They thought they wouldn't survive. The princess stood and looked fearfully at the surviving students. Her eyes were still filled with the nightmare she had experienced just a few hours ago. She couldn't believe that she had managed to get out of that hell. She squinted her eyes and began to scrutinize everyone present. She still couldn't get the horrible images of the murders of innocent students out of her mind. Suddenly her gaze crossed with one student. The girl asked the princess, "Is she still trying to find Xiantian?" The princess looked at her in surprise, but the girl didn't bother to be surprised. She looked at her with round eyes, and taking hold of her chubby cheeks began to ramble, taking the initiative to take an interest in the boy. That's so unlike her. Princess All listened to all this and blushed more and more every second. But soon, there was a huge labor managed to pull herself together. The girl sniggered. What is she talking about? Is it wrong that she wants to thank the one who saved their lives? The girls looked up at the pulsing dome. The teacher had said that all the surviving students were already here. Since he wasn't here yet, it was possible that something terrible had happened after all. But the princess didn't want to believe it. It was impossible. This guy wasn't the type to die for nothing, too. The girl thought about it. He's a head taller than all those who are here, so she's sure the guy is fine. The vice principal came into the tent and addressed the principal. They have searched the entire forest, but the monster's whereabouts are still unknown. There is a possibility that it has possessed one of the students. His voice was anxious. The old man wondered if it was expected. He got up from his seat and wanted to run outside. To prevent the monster and the chance of escape, many students were hurt or killed altogether. The old man intended to take drastic measures. His colleague spread his hands and said that he still needed to recover. Let him deal with it all himself, as if the old man didn't listen to him. His eyes lit up with rage and he shouted that he would kill the monster with his own hands. It was impossible to stop him at that moment. He walked quickly out of the tent. All the research devices are ready. Have them act as soon as they notice any anomaly. The vice director simply nodded. He realized that there was no need to argue with him now. The old man came out of the tent and ordered all the students to come up one by one and lay out the monster cores they received. He would evaluate and announce the results of the competition. There were cheers from everywhere. Some were lamenting the fact that they hadn't been able to kill a single monster, and now they simply didn't have any cores. The vice principal put on his monocle and silently watched each of the students, pretending to evaluate the stones. The monsters were too strong this time. They were lucky to have survived at all. 29. A multitude of students crowded in front of him. Everyone was talking amongst themselves in a low voice. Someone was saying that he was only able to buy 4 monsters. Then he would definitely pass. Another student teamed up with other people and killed 3, but still passed. Among them, that snake-like man was also standing there. He nodded contemptuously at them and said they were just a bunch of trash. It's not that the monsters were strong. It's that they were too weak. Now he's going to show them what real strength is. He threw off his bag of cannonballs. Many colored pebbles with holy power poured out onto the table. There were at least a few dozen cores. The student had really done a very good job. A whisper was heard among the other students. There are so many nuclei. Chung Mi-xiang is truly worthy of being the young master of his clan. His strength surpasses many geniuses of this generation. At this time, the guy was just mocking the other students without paying attention to anyone. This is what real strength means. They're all just pathetic worms. The girls glared at him. What an arrogant, insolent, and oppressive freak he was. With such a young master, she was beginning to worry about the future of the Huayun clan. Her friend snickered. But he's still a force to be reckoned with. All of his statements backed up by his incredible strength. Unfortunately, she doesn't think there's any student stronger than him. Suddenly, the student's tirade was interrupted by a familiar voice. He was asked how he could be so loud with so few nukes. Everyone else turned around in surprise at the voice. They recognized it immediately. That voice couldn't be confused with anything. The princess, as soon as she heard it, immediately smiled. The girl had already understood everything. Bathed you went, boys. They were intact, alive, and well. Xian walked along with them, putting his hands behind his back. They were completely unconcerned and apparently satisfied with the work they had done. Behind their backs were bags of booty. Hao smiled with a full mouth. Achidically said that it was cool to be the center of attention. Xian looked irritably at his brother, who had the same girl on his back. It seems she would have been conscious if he had told me about the treasure, and they would not have wasted time and would have been out of here long ago. His brother looked at him with a hurt look. He was the one who thought that there would be treasures in the sealed area. It wasn't his fault that there was nothing there. Brother tried his best to justify himself. The protagonist folded his arms across his chest and said that this competition was pretty much fun. Chang madly laughed and said that he was able to survive after all. What did he just yell out there? Xiang that he was able to gather more nukes than him? Xian smiled, of course, but what else could it mean? He realized that he was now the winner of this competition. Everyone else looked at the protagonist in surprise. The princess's friend shouted that he was incredibly cool. She seemed to be falling in love with him. The guy walked over to the table where the magic stones were already poured out and asked the principal to bring him a bigger table. The guy smiled and squinted his eyes at everyone. He shifted his gaze to his rival and said that he wanted to show him that there was always someone better than him. After a while, there was a big table in front of him with Chung standing behind it, and the echidna asked, "Is this table enough for him?" Well, now they will see how many kernels he has collected. The guy smiled and said, "Now let him watch carefully." He carefully took off his spatial belt. In one deft motion, he tossed it high into the air. The belt glowed with a bright light. The protagonist told everyone not to be very surprised. A second later, magic cores sprinkled from the sky like rain. There was just some incredible amount of them. Indeed, it was as if there was some kind of emerald rain all around. Chang bared his eyes in astonishment. It was simply impossible. How did he have so many magic nuclei? It was simply impossible to believe it. The guy just stood there as if dumbfounded. A mountain of magic nuclei was already flying at him. Everyone else, including the principal, was just shocked. So many nuclei. How did he manage to gather such a large amount of nuclei? Chung was already completely engulfed by these nuclei, but they were still coming. Were there students? How did he manage to collect so many cores? Did he kill all the monsters by himself? Chang was already completely buried under those cores. His henchmen looked at the mountain of magic cores with envy. There were their cores there too. Xiang glared at his rival. But was he satisfied now? One's strength should not be used to look down on others. Chung finally made it outside and looked at the protagonist. The princess and her friend looked at it with admiration and surprise. That's right. He had completely trampled on that freak's arrogance. Chang got to his feet and looked like he had been possessed by the devil. He shook himself off and spit on the ground and told the protagonist not to lecture him. So what if he took quantity? Quality is a far more important factor. Killing one highly ranked monster is far more valuable than 100 somewhat ranked ones. He took out a large glowing yellow stone from his pocket. A smile stretched across his face. What could he say about this level 3 monster core? This core is much more valuable. The vice director corrected his monocle and took a closer look. This is indeed a level 3 core. It looked like he had kept an ace up his sleeve until the last moment. The headmaster crossed his arms over his chest. Well, he is the young master of the clan. They always like to do that. Chang approached the protagonist and gazed triumphantly into his eyes. So, his pile of knee with Quran voice trash against a single level 3 core. Who does he think will win? The protagonist just crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the core with indifference. Xian smiled and called out to his older brother. The boy tossed the sleeping girl and Tita managed to catch her. Chung He didn't relent. He shouted that it was too late to call his brother and beg for mercy. The guy was in his repertoire and still just as arrogant and condescending. Who ran closer and told him to shut up. That's not why his brother called him. They bumped fists in a friendly way. The main character always trusts his older brother to play to the public and show too cool things. Who got proud of himself? He's a pro at it. The guy rummaged through his pockets, and after a second he pulled out a bright red-colored stone from there. It glistened in the sun, and literally exuded the strongest magical energy. Wu pointed his finger at it and shouted, "And what does he say to that? Would he not like to share his thoughts on this stone?" Chung didn't know what to say. His legs shook and his breath hitched. This is a level 4 core? That's simply impossible. Even the principal and vice principal couldn't contain their astonishment. What the hell? Could this be the core of that monster? The two men stood there not knowing what to say. In all their practice, they had never seen such a thing before. Hu didn't stop being important. He was leaning on the table, proudly looking at the stone. So, he said something about the importance of quality over quantity. Did he have anything to say for himself? Chang began to stammer in disbelief. He shouted that these two were definitely cheating. How were they able to kill a rank 4 monster? Even he wouldn't be able to handle it. The old man didn't know what to say. He was in a bit of shock himself. But still, this was something that needed to be sorted out. Chung just boiled with rage. He couldn't believe that his strength was being questioned. The others started to make fun of him. And no, the kid cried. He had asked for it. Xian made a grimace and told him to remember that there would always be bigger fish, so he advised him to be more restrained next time. Here he still could not stand it because of shouting at the protagonist that how dare this freak to talk to him like that. Who the hell is he? The guy just stood there and smiled. Suddenly, the vice principal intervened. He grabbed the student's arm and stopped his attempt to start a fight. The man said that they were now on the academy grounds. Let him watch his behavior. At this time, the principal looked at the protagonists and said in a serious voice that they would go with him. They would need to clarify something. Everyone looked at each other with uncomprehending looks. The director cast his spell, and after a second, they started moving to another place. The protagonists were enveloped by pillars of energy and began to move them to some unknown place. Everyone else watched in horror and amazement at what was happening. The girls wondered what was even going on. It was the first time they had ever seen the headmaster look so serious. The princess couldn't say anything. She only stuttered and asked herself, how did they manage to get a level 4 core? The girl raised an uncomprehending gaze upwards and thought for a moment. There were many dangers in this dense forest, the likes of which they had never encountered before. This core was not as simple as it looked at first glance. This magical thing held some kind of secret, and now it had to be made clear. In the middle of the room stood a large mirror that reflected everything that was happening in the arena. Next to it stood a female teacher. By all appearances, the result was obvious. Several people whose silhouettes were hidden by the darkness sat on high chairs. One of them, who sat in the middle, began to speak. Tomorrow it will be Yu Yue's 16th birthday, and coincidentally the day when they should announce the candidate. The other one sitting next to him asked, "Who does His Majesty think is most suitable for the role?" The man replied that obviously, after the competition, it was clear that Changguan Xiantian was a much more suitable candidate than that arrogant and pompous, frivolous turkey Chengming Xiang. Everyone else supported him. The fat man sitting on the edge laughed. I said that he would never have thought that this clan could cultivate such a genius. The king sat back on his throne and folded his hands in front of him. Well, now that they've come to a unanimous decision, we must issue the decree. The man smiled. His voice sounded very happy. Apparently he was pleased with what was happening. He said that he wanted Xiantian to marry his daughter. Concerned voices were heard in the temple that was in the very same cave. The headmaster was sitting in his office, and looking at the core, the main characters stood in front of him and explained the situation to him. The old man couldn't believe it. So they are saying that this monster got angry, and because of that, it went into physical form, after which Tita and the protagonist finished it off. Hu smiled with a full mouth. He clearly felt proud. The boy said that the principal and himself realized that in terms of annoying, he is the best of the best. His brother confirmed. Thanks to his older brother, Mei Mao was off the hook. The old man frowned. This was indeed the truth. He had never met a more annoying student. The old man sipped some tea from his mug. He still didn't fully believe it. But could it really be possible for rank 4 monsters to be knocked out so easily? Taita was even a little offended, principal. What doubted his strength? The boy said that if the principal wanted to, he could redo this blow right now. The principal waved his hands and even got a little scared. Good, good, good. He doesn't think his room full of antiques can take that punch. He sighed heavily. The old man couldn't believe that this monster was so easy to kill. These people were obviously hiding something. It was necessary to find out as much as possible. The headmaster chuckled. He never would have thought that the monster that even the first headmaster couldn't kill was killed by a trio of students. The main character said it was pure luck. Taita confirmed his words. Right? It was just luck and nothing more. The old man made things serious again, no matter. Since Oni killed that monster, the first place in this competition is awarded to him. He pointed at the main character. This is by far the best result. The boy hesitated. He thought that the headmaster realized that they didn't tell everything, but he decided not to ask further. Perhaps he doesn't want to make things worse. The principal broke out into a smile. He was very pleased. The old man thanked them for helping him deal with such a problem. Now, he could breathe a sigh of relief. The students were still standing in their place and were in utter incomprehension. Suddenly, the very pillars with which the protagonists had moved appeared. Something was happening again. They watched in amazement as the principal along with the students appeared from the pillars of light. From this angle, they looked amazing. When the movement was completed, the principal smilingly said that the winner of this competition was Changguan Xiantian. At this time, he stood a little far away from the principal and looked around everyone with a victorious gaze. The principal continued to speak. This is the end of the competition. Everyone can be dismissed. The injured should be examined as soon as possible. Chang was just furious. He didn't intend to leave it like this. Xian had definitely cheated. How come he was the winner? He couldn't believe it. He wouldn't be able to kill a rank 4 monster. The headmaster suddenly transformed from a good-natured old man to a stern, gray-bearded old man. He ordered the boy to be silent. How dare he interfere with the academy principal's decision? If he had any questions, he could ask them in the principal's office. Chang overwhelmed. This was the first time he had seen the principal like this. The guy immediately shut up and nodded his head. He didn't want to cause more trouble for himself. At this time, the vice principal was tending to the wounded. Hurry up and help the wounded. The rest of you can go back to your rooms. Taita rushed into the tent with the doctor and said that they brought the wounded girl. At this time, the female doctor was holding an enormous syringe, and there was a guy tied up on the table, apparently preparing for the worst. A little prick, and he'd be as good as a cucumber. There was an unconscious guy sitting next to him. Apparently, he'd already been through the procedure. At that moment, they realized that they were more likely to be crippled than cured. The protagonist came out of the tent and there was a princess waiting for him. She said she was looking for him and immediately blushed with shame. The guy looked at her and asked, "Is everything with her early and all right?" The girl blushed with embarrassment and blushed even more. "Yes, everything's fine." She heard that the guy had saved them all, so she wanted to thank him. Xian smiled a good-natured smile and said that it wasn't necessary, but he hoped that they had sorted out the past misunderstanding. The girl became even more embarrassed, and her cheeks finally blushed. She said in a quiet voice that those who sacrifice themselves for the good of others definitely can't be bad people. Earlier, she had insulted him, so let the guy forgive her as well. A sincere remorse could be heard in the girl's words. She smiled and said that her name was Yu Yue. The girl extended her hand to the protagonist. He smiled and also extended his hand to her that his name was Xian Tian. Their hands were already a few centimeters apart, and a handshake was about to take place. But suddenly that same female teacher appeared from somewhere. She stepped between them and pushed both students away from each other. She appeared literally out of nowhere. It seemed that this woman was following them. Yu Yue didn't expect to see her teacher here. The girl looked at her with a surprised look. "What is she doing here? What's the matter?" The woman shifted her gaze to the protagonist and sternly said that he shouldn't relax. He should not be happy yet. For him, the problems had just begun. The girl looked at all this and understood nothing. The woman teacher told her student to follow her and added significantly that something big was about to happen. Without waiting for an answer, she grabbed the girl and dragged her behind her. The poor girl waved goodbye and stammered an apology. She was terribly embarrassed at this moment. Xian waved back at her, but still didn't understand anything. The little guy sighed heavily. Why is he speaking in riddles again? Couldn't he just say it in normal language? He was starting to get a little annoyed. That woman seemed strange. What did she want? Tita was sitting at the table eating a huge piece of meat. The guy was incredibly satisfied. It had been so long since he had eaten well that he would eat anything in the world right now. The main character was also sitting next to him. It looked like he was just meditating. Tita lamented. What a pain in the ass. Once the girl woke up, she said she couldn't remember anything, and he thought he could be friends with the two girls in the academy. Xian told him not to be discouraged. At least they still had a prize left. Just have him wait for his brother to bring all the monster cores to them. The door swung open and Big Brother appeared on the doorstep. He was the one they were talking about. The guy laughed and shouted at the top of his voice that he had great news. Xian smiled and asked why his brother was so excited. Was the prize really a beautiful girl? A sneer could clearly be heard in this question. To everyone's surprise, the older brother said it was like that. Does he really know everything? Xian and his friend looked at Big Brother in surprise. What? The prize was really a girl? This was simply unbelievable. Such a guy was definitely not expected. After hearing that, the main character seemed to be upset. This wasn't going according to his plan. He frowned and stopped talking. This had to be dealt with. Hu puzzled why did his little brother seem so upset. Tita confirmed he would be able to marry the beautiful princess. What's wrong with him? Obviously, the main character didn't share their joy. He turned away and folded his arms across his chest. He doesn't even know who this girl is, and he's already being told to marry her. He won't stand for it. Hu seemed to be happier than his younger brother. He spread his arms to the sides and shouted that this princess is the only child of the current emperor. Xian listened to this and became even more gloomy. He disliked all of this even more. He shifted his gaze to his older brother and looked at him spitefully. He was silent and did not know what to say. Xian turned to him and asked in a completely indifferent tone, "So what? What's the big deal?" It turned out it didn't bother him at all. Hu hesitated for a moment. He didn't expect such a reaction. But that's all he knows. The guy scratched the back of his head and tried to remember anything else. This princess is quite a mysterious person. Only the imperial family knows what she looks like, and outside the palace, and no one has seen her. Tita wondered, is this princess so scary that they decided to hide her? Hu began to explain. Even if she's scary, she's still a princess. If his brother marries her, in the future the whole country will be in his power. Xian Na frowned. He wasn't the least bit interested in becoming emperor. Why should he let anyone decide his fate? This was all starting to make him incredibly angry. The boy got up from his seat and walked briskly towards the door. He decided to go for a walk. and this whole thing had pissed him off, and now he needed to calm down. He opened the door with a sharp movement. 129 Tita, scared, asked his older brother. He wouldn't refuse, right? Hu replied in an equally frightened voice. If he refuses, then things will be very bad. Giving a refusal to the emperor is tantamount to insulting his honor. We need to persuade the guy as soon as possible. He jumped out into the street following his younger brother and shouted for him not to jump to conclusions. He needed to change the boy's mind as soon as possible, or there would be trouble. But the main character was already gone. There was no one on the street. Xian probably went somewhere secluded because it was beginning to annoy him. A small, neat gazebo stood on a hill in complete solitude. There were several people in it, 2 women standing inside talking about something. There the princess and her teacher were talking. The girl holding a piece of watermelon asked in a concerned voice, "Does the teacher think the guy will agree to the wedding? After all, he doesn't even know that she is the princess." The woman replied that his family would definitely agree. After all, it's a great opportunity for them to rise again. But she can't say anything about Xiantian himself. Yue took a bite of a piece of watermelon and began to chew diligently. If he is one of those who is greedy da power and agrees to the wedding, then she will immediately go to her father and ask him to cancel it. The woman asked, "What will happen in case he does not agree?" Hearing this question, the girl blushed and bit off a little more. But if he doesn't agree, she will. We'll think about it. The girl became embarrassed. The teacher sighed heavily. So if he says yes, this girl will say no. But if he says no and she says yes, the older she gets, the less their generation understands. Suddenly, the woman looked somewhere to the side. She saw something there. Loud footsteps came from outside. Xian was walking straight towards their gazebo with a fast gait. Well, as soon as they remembered him, here was the guy. It was as if he didn't notice them and was muttering to himself. Just a little while ago, he was in the forest and just hunting monsters, and now, out of the blue, they want to marry him off to a princess. He wouldn't be able to advance in cultivation with another person by his side. Suddenly, a watermelon rind flew just past him and he snapped out of his musings. The boy looked forward before him in surprise. He shifted his eyes to the direction from which it had come and looked there in surprise. Yue sat there and held a watermelon in her hands. She looked at the guy and asked if he wanted to have a snack together, since it was such a coincidence. The main character walked up to her and asked why she was here. I had somewhere to go, after all. Yue said that she was all sorted out and decided to rest, and also, she heard a rumor that he was going to marry the princess. Is that true? Xian sat down next to her and the girl gave him a slice of watermelon. He asked where the girl had heard this before. She replied that she had her sources. The girl congratulated him on his future marriage. The guy didn't seem enthusiastic. What's there to congratulate him on? What good is that? And he's going to have to marry someone he's never even met. Yue said that if he marries the princess, the power of the country will be transferred to him in the future. Many can only dream of such a thing. Xian looked at her with a serious look, and biting a piece of watermelon said that if he needed anything, he would get it himself. The girl looked at him with surprise and asked if he was going to reject the emperor's offer. The guy continued to chew the watermelon with a nonchalant look. He said thoughtfully, "If it's the imperial family's decision, then if he refuses, it might affect his family too. Especially, he didn't really want to offend the princess. He didn't want to hurt innocent people." The girl looked at him with great respect and said that she didn't think he cared so much about other people. Xian turned to her and said, "He carries too young for all this. Therefore, he only wants to focus on cultivation. And for marriage, he will deal with it when he becomes strong enough to negotiate with the imperial family as an equal." Yue admiringly looked at him. These are too mature words for a young lad. Did he really lie about his age? Xian almost choked on his watermelons. Is she suspecting something too? He tried his best to deflect suspicion and said that he was still a child. Let the girl eat the watermelon and don't get distracted. She just looked at him with a suspicious look. They continued to sit in the gazebo for a while longer, with someone watching them. It was the same woman teacher. She was also chewing watermelon, standing in the bushes. She realized that she no longer understood today's generation at all. Strange kids. The sun continued to give its bright rays in the land. Vegetation was abuzz all around. The day was in full swing. Cheng Ming Xian somehow managed to steal the protagonist's older brother. and now he had introduced interrogation. He beat him to a pulp, so much so that the poor guy was covered in blood and lay on the earth. The guy asked, "Where is Xiantian?" Chang was furious. If this freak didn't tell now, he would go to the other world right now. His eyes were burning with madness. They were facing each other, and a fight was about to take place between them. The situation was getting hotter and hotter by the second. Hu already had a broken head. He was breathing heavily and said that it was the Emperor's decision. Did he really think he could get the princess by killing Xiantian? Cheng had already completely lost his mind with rage. He was shouting that he was the young master of the Huayun clan. Princess Gailan should marry him. The fact that this old marasmus decided to marry the princess to this little brat was definitely a mistake. Hu said that they are not allowed to behave like this on the academy grounds. The principal will not allow such behavior. They definitely won't get away with this kind of behavior. Cheng didn't hear him at all. He had built up energy in his punch and swung his fist. His father had invited the principal and Bayan to visit his clan, and that's why no one in this academy will save him now. Hu climbed to his feet and got into a fighting stance. He doesn't expect anyone to come to his rescue. His opponent seems to have forgotten something. The kid's eyes squinted. He still had his trump up his sleeve. He seemed to have forgotten that his main element was earth. A second passed as the ground shook beneath Chang's feet, and several stone pillars grew. He barely had time to stay on his feet. He was standing on one of those pillars, and he didn't realize anything. It seemed like he would have to chase after that bastard. Hu took advantage of the moment and started running in the opposite direction. He needed to save his life. The guy realized that he couldn't do it alone against this man. He was too strong. Chang was not confused, and waving his clawed hand released several energy waves towards the poor guy, which began to chase him with a whistling sound. A second later, the older brother felt something sharp and hot slamming into his back. He was unable to stay on his feet and fell to the ground. His breathing became labored. There were several cuts on his back, and not bleeding, the guy turned back around, and there were already several of Chang's henchmen ahead of him. They seemed to be surrounding him. The situation was getting more and more complicated. He prepared to fight alone against the three. He wouldn't be able to hide in the academy grounds. One of those freaks had already started to accumulate energy for his strike. He won't be able to fight since he's outnumbered. He can't hide in the academy either. We should try hiding at the foot of the mountain. The guy pushed himself off the ground. If with incredible speed he began to run away, Chang gritted his teeth and ordered his buddies to follow the bastard. There was no way to let him escape. While his brother was on the verge of death, the protagonist was having a nice conversation with a girl in seclusion. She said he had better not be in a hurry to refuse the marriage proposal. There were no more watermelons left in the plate, but only a few empty crusts. Yue raised her finger up and said meaningfully that the princess might be much better than he thought. The girl suddenly changed her attitude towards the guy, and now it was as if she was trying to change his mind. Jian almost swallowed his tongue. He looked at the girl with surprise and asked, "Does she know the princess? Is she a member of the imperial family?" The girl smiled and hummed some uncomplicated song to herself. She leaned over to the protagonist and said that he would soon find out everything himself. Xian did not understand anything and only goggled at her. Yue stood up from her seat and said that she had to go now. The girl did not wait for an answer and walked backwards. Xian was alone with his thoughts. The girl ran so fast that he did not have time to ask her any questions. Now he stood by the empty gazebo and pondered. Yes, in the past and now. He couldn't understand what the girl was thinking. The boy looked thoughtfully into the distance. Suddenly his musings were interrupted behind his back. The protagonist immediately came to his senses and twitched with fear and surprise. A familiar feeling visited him. Several holy forces clashed in a battle. What was even going on there? He turned around towards the sound and looked there with a surprised look. Hu already was holding on to his feet with his last strength. His clothes were completely covered in blood. He no longer had the strength to run away, and his opponents were not tired at all. Cheng seems to have just started warming up. What a brave man. Except their cat-and-mouse game ends here. He jumped up sharply and thrust his clawed hand forward. Now he's going to deliver the final blow and that asshole will be finished. There were already a few meters between them when suddenly, a magical holy energy began to move towards them. Cheng was forced to repel the unknown attack. He put out his hand and knocked the energy beam aside. He didn't understand anything at all. The main character appeared from somewhere and he quickly jumped towards his big brother. Xian jumped up to him and helped him to his feet. He was scared and asked his big brother if he was all right. Hu, still not understanding anything, looked at his little brother who suddenly came to his aid. Hu looked at his little brother and said, "That man wants to kill him. Tell him to hurry up and get out of here." The protagonist didn't understand anything and let out his eyes in surprise. Out of his last strength, the older brother told him to let him find the principal. He no longer had any strength left at all, and the guy fell to the ground from exhaustion. Chang pointed his clawed finger at them and laughed a crazy laugh. What a pleasant surprise this was. Xian Tian decided to take the initiative to show himself first. If he kills him, the princess will belong to him. Chang was already completely mad and was ready to destroy everything in his path. Xiang's face changed. He became serious, even angry. His voice was somehow metallic, even and calm. Right now, he had a real killer in him. Even though his brother can be annoying and stupid, but still he is his brother. He's always risking himself to help him, and he gives his best. In this world, his older brother is the only person besides his mother he can consider his sister. And now, his blood is on Xian's hands. His voice became more and more threatening. The guy had changed beyond recognition. He was emanating an aura so monstrous that anyone standing nearby would have their legs buckled in fear. Xian just stood there, staring at his opponent. Right now, all he saw in front of him was a target to be destroyed. His face transformed and became predatory. Blood must be paid for with blood, didn't he think? Now the guy looked like he was ready to tear the world apart. His brother had dared to be hurt, and now they would all pay. An energy aura began to grow around him, engulfing his entire body. The entire space around him was enveloped in light. He began to accumulate holy power. How dare they hurt him? They'll all pay for this. Xian was furious. Now this freak is going to die. He looked at his opponent with the eyes of a true beast seeing its prey. It didn't take Cheng long to realize that he was afraid. But why is he afraid? He's the young master of his clan, the strongest in this academy. So why does he feel fear? The boy prepared for the fight with clenched teeth. He looked forward, but he didn't feel as confident as before. For some reason, fear for his own life appeared in his soul for the first time in a long time. Now he's in a fighting stance. Well, let's see who's going to die today. He released his claws forward and looked like a huge spider. An aura of magical energy also appeared around him. With a wave of its clawed paw, it threw a squeeze of meteor towards the protagonist. A bundle of energy erupted from his hand and flew straight forward. Xian summoned his sword and looked at his opponent with a fierce gaze. Does he still think that he is the strongest in the Kargat Academy? Right now, his self-confidence would diminish. The protagonist broke out of his seat and ran forward. It's about time to bring him down. He wasn't afraid. There was only rage and a desire for revenge in his soul. Within seconds, the two boys clashed in a fierce battle. Metal rattled, and shards of light flew in different directions. Their strength was almost equal, and now there could only be one winner. Chung couldn't believe what he saw. This guy could parry his strike so accurately. This was the first time he was facing an opponent who was as strong as him. Now fear had finally entered his soul. He didn't understand this guy had only recently reached the saint level. How could he be able to control saint power so perfectly? There was no way. Xian wielded his sword perfectly, fending off all attacks as if he was not just a student, but a skilled warrior. That was basically the case. It was just that no one knew about it. He deftly dodged another attack and stealthily prepared to stab his opponent with his sword right in the throat to finally finish the creep off. But his opponent was not so simple. Chang saw all of this and dodged. The energy jet passed within a few centimeters of his face and flew further away. It crashed into a nearby tree, and in one fell swoop, sliced it in half. He saw that there was blood on his body. This made him horrified. This guy was able to hurt me. He thought simply. It was impossible. No, he was just lucky. He concentrated even more magical energy in his hand and swung. Anger raged in his soul. It was necessary to defend his part, or else he wouldn't survive this disgrace. They fought again. A punk like him can't do that. He swung his arm but missed again. The protagonist dodged every blow. Chang was already out of control. This was his fatal mistake. He swung his arms in different directions, His movements were unfocused, and the protagonist easily dodged them. Running behind him, the guy dodged and with one powerful blow hit him right in the back. Blood spurted out. Chang gave a surrendered groan. He couldn't dodge this attack. He stood holding his injured back and felt the force slowly leaving his body. The blow was incredibly strong and fast, the likes of which he had never seen before. Gritting his teeth, he looked at his opponent. But why? It seemed as if he was anticipating all of his attacks. He can't hit him at all. Xian stood a little far away and looked at his opponent with a piercing gaze. His body was enveloped by an energy that literally became one with him. Previously, it had been lenient on him. The guy thrust forward his sword, which had an incredible amount of energy accumulated in it. Normally, he wouldn't kill anyone, but not today. His eyes looked frantic, anger swirling within him. He dared to injure his big brother. This was unforgivable. His voice suddenly became quiet and calm. His face transformed, and only one phrase escaped his lips. Die. A multitude of rays of light pierced Cheng's body. He had no time to do anything, not even to think of dodging. His body was immediately pierced by an incredible pain. He tried to cover himself with his hands, but it didn't work. He was so hot that his blood seemed to boil. He fell to the ground, covering himself with his hands in fear. All of his clothes were bloody. His heart was beating at an incredible rate, and there was incredible fear in his soul. The main character slowly approached him while holding his sword. Chang held onto his shoulder in advance, and slowly crawled back. Xian disdainfully looked at him and began to speak softly. What good is the title of young clan master or the strongest in the academy? He doesn't care about those ranks. If he wants to kill him, it will just do it. Chang continued to stagger back, his voice trembling. He begged to sit him down, eyes running in different directions. He had already accepted his fate. Inside himself, the guy realized that he had lost this battle. He realized that now his end was coming. With his last strength, he clung to the last shards of life. His eyes were running in different directions. He couldn't believe that this man was about to kill him. His whole life flashed before his eyes. He began to remember moments from his training. He was proud of him as a kid. It takes months for ordinary people to learn these moves. The master was able to learn them in just a day. He is the most gifted genius of this generation. He remembered how he had mocked his peers, calling them just a bunch of trash. He thought all this time that he was special, that he was exceptional. Absolutely everyone in the clan praised his merits, extolled his efforts. The young master has a bright future. Their clan would prosper with him. The boy knew no pity. He killed everyone in his way. He was foretold a great destiny. He would not only become a clan elder, but also the future emperor of this kingdom. This fame and recognition eclipsed the young lord's mind, and now he became just a monster craving only power and might. All this will be his, only his estate. He's the future of the clan and the emperor. He can't lose, he's a genius. He tried to convince himself of his exceptionalism even though he was on the brink of death. Unwilling to believe this, he ordered his henchmen to attack this man altogether. No matter how strong he was, he wouldn't be able to handle so many people. If they kill him, he will lavishly reward each one. The men in dark robes immediately rushed towards the protagonist to kill him on the spot. They were unquestioningly loyal to their master and were willing to do his bidding. Xian generally was not afraid of anything at this moment. They could be as many as they wanted. They could be 100, 200, 1,000. But they were all nothing. They were just nothing in front of his true strength. The guy concentrated the energy of all of his previous generations into himself to deliver a single crushing blow. No one even noticed before he swung his sword, and there was silence in the air. The bodies of the men who had just been ready to tear him to shreds were now themselves shredded. Chang still recognized the strength of the protagonist, but he advised him to stop. This cunning serpent didn't want to back down, and even though he was on the verge of death, he tried to manipulate. He kept his older brother pinned to the ground, and was ready to kill him this very second if the protagonist didn't stop. So if he wants to save his brother, it's right now. Let him cut off his right hand. Xian silently looked in his direction. He had a choice in front of him. It was necessary to save his brother after all. It was almost his only family member in this unfamiliar world. His eyes were filled with rage and anger. Chang continued to hold the poor man, and was already squeezing his head with his sharp fingers. One more second, and the poor man would simply die of exhaustion. Suddenly, a sword slid through the air. It was cutting through space itself. The speed was so inconceivable that it was simply impossible to see it. Chang couldn't take anything in. He suddenly felt a monstrous pain cutting through his body. Blowing his eyes out, he stared forward. The very hand that was holding Hu was cut off. His body was pierced with pain. He didn't even immediately feel what had happened. But still, realization began to come to him. His right arm had been cut off exactly at the shoulder. Xian looked at him with a formidable gaze. He had an extra arm. No problem at all, it could be fixed now. Now he didn't need it anymore. Chang stood holding onto his severed arm. The protagonist jumped up to his older brother, preventing him from falling. Chang screamed with anger and hopelessness. How dare he do such a thing? His father would not forgive him. He will destroy his entire family. Xiang looked at him and calmly said, "If he kills him, no one will know about what happened. Right?" An incredible cruelty and confidence could be heard in his voice. Chang swallowed his tongue and didn't know what to say. He just stared with frightened eyes and realized that he had nowhere to go. After standing like that for a second, he ducked. He ran headlong, screaming for help to save him. The protagonist just looked after him and laughed quietly. Xian turned away and said that he was just a lousy coward who didn't deserve anything. Suddenly, voices were heard behind him. It was the Watch, or Academy. They were asking, "What's going on here? Didn't you decide to break the Academy's rules?" Several teachers jumped out of the bushes. Chang shouted for them to help him because this man wants to kill him. The protagonist stood and held his sword in his hands. People ran to them asking what had happened here. One of them told the others to help the others. There was concern and fear on their faces. Xiang S. was disappointed to realize that it looked like he wouldn't be able to deal with him quietly. Chang ran up to the teachers, and they began to examine his earlier body. "Never mind, none of this was important. We needed to get the injured brother as soon as possible away from here." He picked him up on his shoulders, and with a quick step he ran in the opposite direction. Soon he came to a small cave that was hidden by a thicket. Here they could hide without fear of being found. Hu woke up. His eyes slowly opened, his whole body was sore from his wounds. He didn't realize where he was, so it was all over. He turned his head to the side and saw his little brother lying next to him on the ground. They were in some strange place, and the older brother was very much frightened. His brother was lying next to him with his hands folded on his chest like a dead man. Hu jumped up from his seat and shook his head in different directions. It looked like he had tragically died along with his fourth brother. Is this the underworld? He saw how there was only a cave around him. Hu began to wipe away his tears and apologized for his younger brother, for not being able to save him from that man. Now he can't retire. Xian stood up a little and sighed heavily. His brother started talking nonsense again. He had just woken up and didn't understand anything himself. The protagonist asked for his older brother to finally stop yelling. He had already taken care of Chengming Xiang. There was no way that Hu could not calm down. He should become a ghost and find this person. He would haunt him for the rest of his life. Suddenly he heard his brother's words. "Wait, what?" Hu looked around. Then why is there blood all over? He was sitting on a big bamboo blanket and he didn't understand anything. His younger brother was sitting next to him. Xiang smiled and looked at him from the bone. He said it wasn't blood but a berry he found in the forest. Its juice can stop bleeding. The brother looked at the little berry and said that it was amazing. But how is that possible? Hu threw the berry into his mouth and asked his brother to tell him what happened then. Xian answered. He made it so that this man could no longer use his hand. Originally, the plan was to quietly get rid of him, but the teacher's help came to him. Hu choked on a berry as soon as he heard that. He couldn't believe it. The older brother began to tremble with fear. He bulged his eyes with surprise. What had his little brother just done? He's the only one from the Chung family. The clan will definitely look for him. Hu said in a frightened voice that the fourth brother needed to run away from here, and as far away as possible. The protagonist sat in front of him and listened to him carefully. Xian said that if he escaped from here, the Huayun clan would not leave his family alone. He can't let his mother be dragged into this as well. The boy looked worried. Hu said that unfortunately the principal and vice principal left to visit the Huayun clan. Right now there was no one in the academy to help them. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. At this moment an idea flashed through his mind. So the headmaster is with them now. This could play to their advantage. It was necessary to take advantage of such an opportunity. The Huayun clan had a very large influence in this kingdom. It had a really large and lesser one, and right now the head of the academy was right there. The headmaster was sitting in the large hall along with the vice headmaster. They were at the reception of the clan elder. The large building was filled with the smell of incense. The principal was extremely serious. He addressed the clan head. He asked, had they invited them just to have a drink together? The vice principal said that if that was all, they should go back. They had a lot of unfinished business at the academy. Mr. Chung looked just like his son. He had the same crazy face. Now he looked like some kind of lunatic. They just got here. Let them stay a little longer. The academy will be fine. The man looked a bit twitchy. He waved his finger and said that if anything were to happen, it wouldn't bother them in any way. It was all very strange. The man seemed a little out of it. The principal and vice principal looked at each other. They liked it less and less. The principal asked if this man might want to get rid of Xiantian. The vice principal replied that he wouldn't dare to do it on the academy grounds, right? The clan head thanked the headmaster for looking after his son for all these years. This calls for a drink. But no sooner had they done so, a strange man in black clothes burst into the room and quickly ran straight towards them. He shouted to the master that things were bad. The man looked very worried. The master got to his feet and asked what was wrong. He was so tense, wasn't he? The man tried to catch his breath and said that the young master had lost his arm in a battle with Jiangguan Xiantian. He is very seriously injured and is on the verge of death. Such news made everyone present choke on their drink. This was simply impossible. The man's face transformed, his eyes lit up with rage. Something had happened to his son Yu. Now it was his personal problem. The stars were already lighting up in the sky. Night reigned everywhere, but the windows in the house were burning. The young princess holding a small flatbread happily said that Xiang Tian had injured Ming Xiang's arm. Even though it was terrible news, her face looked joyful. Next to her was that female teacher. She lowered her gaze and said that he would no longer be able to use his arm unless I still called for a 7th-rank Saint Master. The princess took a bite out of her bun and anxiously said that even in the whole kingdom they could not find such a master. The teacher said that their clan head had already sent a letter asking for Xian Tian to be severely punished, causing the emperor to be very worried. Suddenly the princess stood up from the table and said in a serious voice that she would go and personally ask the emperor to forgive the protagonist. Her teacher told the girl not to be so impulsive in her decisions. Yu said he wasn't the kind of person to hurt someone for no reason. Something was clearly not clean here. The woman said that one way or another, it didn't matter now. The Huayun clan. So all right, number 1 in the entire kingdom, and Changguan is just a genius from a poor family. This situation is not at all in his favor. Yue frightenedly lowered her gaze. Would the emperor forgive him? The girl was very worried about her friend because she realized that his situation now was dire. The teacher said that the emperor had enough problems, and besides this guy, he is the emperor after all. The princess was frightened. She realized that an unenviable fate might soon await the lad. She went to the balcony and looked into the distance. The girl was very much worried and did not know where to put herself. The woman watched her and understood her anxiety, but unfortunately she couldn't help her. The next day, the emperor gathered a council to solve the problem that had suddenly arisen. In the emperor's bay were several people who had been at his reception. The emperor himself was seated on a throne on a dais. The man was dressed in opulent clothes that shone with all shades of luxury. His stern gaze stared straight ahead. A whole day has passed and Xiang Tian hasn't returned yet? Asked the emperor. Chung said that he was sure he was still hiding in the academy grounds. May your majesty allow him to join the search. The headmaster is furious not anymore. He won't let him do whatever he wants. Chung made himself crazy. He was recently informed that Changguan had arrived at the academy. How will the principal be able to explain this? The old man wondered. Changguan has arrived at the academy? This is unbelievable. The vice principal was also in a bit of shock. Chang folded his arms and once again asked His Majesty, allow him and his men to join the search before Changguan Ba and his son escape. Suddenly a rough male voice was heard from outside. He said there was no need for that. He had brought his son. On the threshold of the royal palace stood the head of the family along with his son. The main character was bound in chains and couldn't move. Everyone was simply shocked at what they saw. Ba sincerely apologized for allowing his son to make such a mistake, and asks the emperor to punish him justly. Chang shouted at him not to make a spectacle of himself. At this time, the man kneeled down and bowed low. He just wants His Majesty to forgive his son, Changguan. Kneeling in front of the man with his hands folded, he sincerely asked for forgiveness for his son's actions. He would bring him to the Huayun clan's house where he could punish him as he wished. Chang was shocked at this sudden appearance. He waved his hands and shouted for the man not to touch him with his filthy hands. Xian suddenly shouted. He said that he himself should answer for the crimes he had committed. He was the one who maimed their son, so if they want to do something, let them punish him, and let them keep his family out of it. The emperor said that if it was the family that wanted justice, he thought Chang should take them up on their offer. The man looked at the emperor in surprise, but the emperor was completely serious. He gritted his teeth in rage no matter what this family was up to. Since he had ventured into their territory, he wouldn't come out of there alive. The man nodded his head. In that case, only Xian Tian would be punished. He was furious and wanted to get justice for his family. He ordered his servants to take the boy to his family's house. They obediently nodded and prepared to fulfill the master's will. The directors, along with the vice principal, just watched the whole thing. The vice principal gritted his teeth and couldn't hold back his anger. The old man looked at him spark but didn't say anything. The director gestured him to stop and ordered him not to interfere. Let him not be so impatient, we should just observe. They stood back and watched the chained boy being led forward. The headmaster squinted his eyes. Perhaps this boy had another surprise in store for them. The old man was sure it wouldn't end that easily. An hour ago, the protagonist's father flew to the academy. The griffin landed right on the main square. The man jumped off it and ran to his son. He ran up to him and said that he flew here as soon as he heard about the incident. Is he all right? The father looked very worried, but the protagonist looked at him with an uncomprehending look. The guy asked in surprise. He wouldn't blame him for causing trouble for his family. The head of the family said it was his fault for failing to protect him. His son did the right thing by punishing the villains, but he's afraid they won't let him go. The head of the family said that he had already prepared everything to get his son out of the kingdom. But the protagonist shook his head. No. If he left, the Huayun clan would not spare his family. It can't be like this. Hearing these words, the father was ready to cry. What a good son he is. He's so worried about his family. The main characters made a disgruntled grimace. He's more worried about his mom than his family. He turned his gaze to his father, a snide smile appearing on his face. Besides, he has a plan and he's counting on his father's help. And so he was already standing chained in front of his abusers. But the guy was completely calm. He had a plan. All that remained was to put it into action. He smiled widely. Well, now he would see what this clone was capable of. Of course, he wasn't going to give up so easily. Several people were leading him, holding on to the hook. The boy didn't have a chance to break free. The servants held tight. They were walking down the steps, or the guy to their residence. Xian looked around and studied the surroundings. There were many trees growing all around. They were climbing up the mountain. It was not a long way ahead of them. Xian asked the people leading him, "This is not the way to the mountain, right?" The servant raised his eyebrows in surprise. It seemed like the guy was starting to guess something. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was Chang. His hand was bandaged and he was surrounded by his loyal subjects. The boy shouted that now the protagonist would pay for what he had done to his arm. He was completely rewrapped in bandages and now looked like a mummy. The guy was furious. He would finally get even with him for all the wrongs done to him. Xian smiled. Finally, this freak had finally stuck it out. Now his plan to realize himself. He looked at his abuser carefully. He was really looking forward to their meeting now. No one would interfere with them. His father was shocked. His son wants him to turn him into the Huayun family. Is he crazy? It's certain death. They won't let him live. Xian smiled and said that he heard that the headmaster is currently in this particular clan. As long as they are there, then this clan won't dare to touch him. So he is safe for now. Cheng Mingxian. He is a very malicious person. So if he goes to their mountain, he will definitely want revenge. This is a good chance for him. So don't let his father worry about anything. But there was no way the man could agree with this. This is enemy territory. He won't let his son do such dangerous things. But the protagonist was not going to back down. He looked at his father with a look that made the man feel cold inside. If he wanted to save his family, there was no choice. He has to do it. The boy waved his hand and electrical discharges appeared in the air and flew into the trees at a rapid speed. The father shifted his gaze in that direction with horror. Several energy waves flew straight into the nearby trees. They split the air and moved at some unthinkable speed. A second later, all the trees that were standing there were cut by a sharp sword. My father stood there and couldn't believe his eyes. The man began to stammer. Now he was even afraid of his son. He couldn't even imagine what kind of power his child had. Xian looked at him and calmly said, "With his strength, there is no one in this clan who can stop him. So let his father not worry about him. He is completely safe. No one can harm him." At that moment, the father realized a very important thing. His son was no longer the little boy he knew. He had matured a lot in that time. It's been a long time. Punching himself in the chest, the father said that this time he would help him. The servants rushed at the protagonist and bared their swords. They realized that as long as Guy was chained, he wouldn't be able to harm in any way. Chang triumphed. Now he will kill this insolent man. Xian smiled with such a number. Is he hoping for something? This is just stupid. The protagonist in one easy movement broke the chains as if they were some kind of rags. Now a magical weapon formed in his hands. He prepared to attack. The boy already realized that victory was in his hands. Little Chang had no idea what kind of trap he had just fallen into. Xian broke away from his seat and ran at such a speed that the ground began to fly out from under his feet. Chengming Xian just stared stunned and couldn't do anything. The emperor's residence was still as calm. The meeting was still going on there. The sun was already nearing sunset, and its warm rays covered the big, beautiful castle. The emperor put his hand on his head and asked Chang, what was he going to do with this boy? The exact cause of his son's injury had not yet been determined, so he advised him to forget about his revenge for now. Chang says it's okay, no need to worry. They will find out the truth first and then try to come to a fair conclusion. Suddenly, his servant burst into the room. He told his master that things were very bad. The man looked worried. He said that Xian Tian had taken his son hostage and then escaped. Everyone present was simply shocked. This wasn't within the realm of anything at all. Cheng was furious. It looked like he'd been tricked. The principal himself was shocked. He didn't understand anything at all. The servant fell to the floor completely exhausted. His face was mangled and his eyes rolled back. What the hell happened? What the hell is this guy doing? The servant realized that his master had ordered Xian Tian to be captured and killed, but it was the master himself who ended up being captured. The protagonist put a ball to his throat and told them to get him out of here if they didn't want the guy to be headless. After that, he beat everyone up badly and ran away. The main character left everyone lying on the ground and quickly walked in the opposite direction. The protagonist's father pointed his finger at Cheng and asked why they had given their son permission to kill Xian Tian. It was clear to everyone now. They are simply not controllable. The emperor was furious. This is what they call a fair decision. This is simply unacceptable. Chang realized that he was now trapped, damn it. He had to think of something or he would be executed on the spot. He hit his servants as hard as he could. What a loser. The protagonist's father at this time was just contentedly watching. It was just perfect. Their plan had worked like clockwork. He kneels before the emperor and asks him to allow him to go in search of his son, and asks him not to blame his family for what happened. The emperor rose from his seat and looked sternly forward. For such a just and praiseworthy attitude of the Changguan family, he will give the following order. Their family is no longer involved in this case. Therefore, all charges pertaining to this family are no longer valid. The man smiled to himself. Their scheme had succeeded. However, there was one thing. Due to Changguan Xiangtian hiding from the scene of the crime, he's declared a wanted criminal. Everyone folded their hands and obediently lowered their heads in agreement. Everyone knelt down and obediently bowed to the emperor. But still the case ended in success. 5 days have passed since the events. The events moved to the border city of the Gasun Kingdom, Bayun City. The place was bustling with activity. The market was crowded with people selling various goods. A few food carts stood near the stalls. Today they are a kingdom. A man in dark clothes greeted the merchant and said that he would be their escort from the mercenary association. The man took a piece of paper and began to scrutinize it. However, this man was so young, how did he get such a job? He asked what his name was. The stranger adjusted the collar of his clothes and smiled. It was none other than our protagonist. He wrapped himself more tightly in his cloak and said his name was Jiang Chen. The palace was as bustling as ever. The emperor had innumerable matters to attend to at once. There were several people sitting at the big long table. It looked like the emperor had an important meeting again. Hua Yunzong had again sent him a letter asking him to marry Ming Xiang to the princess. The man folded his hands and looked at the people present carefully. He told them to tell him that the princess was away, so the matter of the wedding was postponed indefinitely. Everyone wondered, is the princess really gone? Wouldn't it be rash to postpone the wedding like this? The headmaster slapped his hand on the table and raised his voice. He said that the right to the wedding was given to Changguan Xiantian because of his outstanding skills. Perhaps he could be the one to solve the kingdom's crisis. The emperor seemed to be furious. Everyone present lay low. No one wanted his wrath to fall on them. The emperor continued to rage. But now that he's gone, who is worthy of the princess? The handicapped Chang Mingxiang? Everyone present didn't know what to say. But if they didn't explain themselves in front of the Huayun clan, there might be trouble. The emperor sighed heavily and sat back down. That's why he issued a decree to give the Huayun clan a huge compensation, in the form of a huge amount of gold and silver, to make them forget about the wedding. The emperor waved his hand as a sign that the audience was over. That was the end of it. He was very tired. Needed some rest. Too many events in a day. The men rose and, bowing to the emperor, walked away from the hall. He needed to rest now. Silence at last. The emperor came out of his office. A woman from the academy was already waiting for him there. She greeted the emperor and gave him a respectful bow. He looked at her. The man asked, had she already finished her preparations? You could see from his face that he was incredibly tired of all this talk and the endless problems that came out of nowhere. The woman looked at him and said that Yu Yue had just left and would be leaving the kingdom in a few days. She worriedly asked the emperor, does he not want to tell her about the crisis of the kingdom? After all, it is a very serious matter, and she is a princess after all. The emperor replied that if he told her and she wanted to stay. The emperor's voice sounded tired. If the destruction of the kingdom was inevitable, this emperor's torment alone would be enough. She will become responsible for Yue's future. The woman bowed and said that she was serving His Majesty. The emperor waved his hand and walked quickly to his room, the woman following him. Suddenly the man raised up his index finger and said in a loud voice that she should show loyalty not to him, but to this kingdom. She looked fearfully at the emperor. She hadn't often seen him like this. Literally with her whole body, she felt that a very strong change was about to come that would invariably affect all of them. The emperor went on his way. The woman was left standing in thought. She did not know what to say in this situation, for she herself realized that the emperor was not in the best position now. Xian stood looking at the setting sun. He was wearing completely different clothes, the cloak hiding his student uniform. He looked pensively into the distance. Soon he would be leaving this kingdom. His father had sent a letter saying that his family's involvement had been completely removed, so he could leave with peace of mind. This situation suddenly reminded him of the times when he had ventured to go down the mountain alone. Suddenly, a very loud rumbling sound was heard from his back. It was as if someone was approaching him with great speed. The boy became alert and got ready. Several riders were rushing towards him, riding strange creatures that looked more like some kind of balls and had horns on their heads. The riders dispersed everyone present, pushing them out of the way. Boxes of goods flew in different directions. The animals were frightened, and the merchants could hardly calm them down. One of the merchants saw a huge box flying straight at him. He had no time to dodge, and the man realized that he was about to be crushed. But the protagonist reacted in time and pulled the man away by the scruff of his neck. The crate with a rumble fell just a few centimeters from his body. The man was trembling with fear. He was already ready to say goodbye to life. In a shaky voice, he thanked the guy for saving him. He just smiled and said that he was a mercenary after all, and it's his job to protect them. He looked ahead where the riders had stopped. Their animals stood beside their masters, tongues out and breathing heavily. Xian suddenly saw something that made him very worried. His eyes widened and the boy became frightened. Men were putting up flyers that had his picture on them. The inscription announced that this man was wanted. There was a bounty on his head. The riders who arrived shouted to the entire county that there was a very big reward for the criminal Changguan Xiantian. Even if they just saw him somewhere, they would also be generously rewarded. The guy sighed heavily, as expected from the #1 clan in the entire kingdom. He left rather quickly, and they had already caught up with him. He wrapped himself even more tightly in his cloak so that no one could notice him. After all, the bottomless cloak would definitely recognize him, all because of that pattern. There had to be any way to get rid of it. The caravan had already begun to move forward. The bulls roared and slowly began to move the heavy wagons. Suddenly, one of the visiting horsemen noticed the protagonist and stared at him. The man seemed to suspect something. He approached him and ordered the protagonist to remove his hood immediately. He looked suspicious, so he needed to check it out. Xian stopped right in front of him and stared intently at the man. Devil! Now the situation was getting worse. If he was revealed, a very big howl would be raised. It couldn't be allowed to be revealed. The men in raincoats surrounded him and said there was a suspicious person here. Well, now they're going to raise the alarm, and the trouble's going to come of its own accord. The guy stopped, and he didn't take any action. He just stood there and waited. A spark appeared in his eyes. He had to act decisively. If it's his people know who he is, whose trouble will abound. The men continued to surround him and pointed their large spears at him. The guy standing in the middle, tangled in his hood, it was impossible to give himself away, but the situation was getting worse by the second. Guy already prepared to attack, there was no choice anyway. These people would now find out who he was, and he would either be imprisoned, or he would have to kill everyone here. But suddenly, help came from nowhere. The very man who had hired him jumped up and told the commander that it was all right. This man was with him. The commander was surprised. This man is with him? Does he know him? Wu Dai hugged the protagonist and laughed and said that he was her wife's younger brother. He insisted on going with him to see the world. A man ran up to the guard and started whispering in his ear. He said that a misfortune had happened to him here when he was a child, and that because of it his face was very badly disfigured, and that was why he wore a cloak. The commander looked at the man with disbelief but still seemed to believe him. Wu Dai continued to persuade the commander. He said that he knew he was a coward, so he would definitely not harbor a criminal. The commander took another hard look at the protagonist and then waved his hand that they could go. They sat down on the wagon and moved forward. The man waved goodbye to the guard and said that when he returned he would call him and his brothers for a drink. Xian looked at the guards who continued to patrol the city looking for him. Wu Dai, relieved, said it's all right, the guards won't chase them. Let him not worry about the people in the caravan either. They only obeyed him. The protagonist sat on the sacks of goods and said nothing. The boy thought for a while and looked at the merchant incredulously. He asked, why was there help for him here? If he turned it in, it could get him a large sum of money. Wu replied that if he was a bad guy, he would have turned him in without hesitation, but his gut told him that the stranger was clearly not one of those. The man looked at the protagonist over his shoulder and smiled. Xian asked him, does he really think he's good? The man sighed and smilingly replied, he has seen countless people over the years, so he can easily tell the bad from the good. Besides, it saved his life at a time when he could have been crushed by a heavy box. Is that a bad deed? It follows from this that he's a good man. Xian smiled and said that he was very pleased to hear that, but now he had to go. The guy already wanted to jump off the wagon, and had already moved to the edge, but the merchant caught him by the scruff of the neck just in time and pulled him back. Xian almost choked. He bulged his eyes and fell on his ass. The merchant stopped him and shouted at him not to run away in a hurry. The man began to poke him in the nose with a paper. It was their business contract. Now he is the escort of this caravan. The man paid to get him to the Blue Wind Kingdom safely. The protagonist sighed. Right? Totally forgot about that. Xianzan thoughtfully looked forward. Well, he still had no idea where to go. Traveling with the caravan wasn't the worst idea. Besides, he would have food, water, and money. He sprawled out on sacks of goods, staring up at the sky. Good, now they're counting on him. For now, he will continue to accompany them. After a while, they built a small camp to rest. Besides, they had to get the animals drunk. They stood in a special campsite for caravans. It would be safer here. Several tents of other caravans were already standing in this place. Also, wagons with goods could be seen there. It was evident that people often stayed in this together. Xian looked around and said that there were quite a lot of people here. The merchant rummaged through his merchandise and replied that everything then that not only caravans were here, but also to seek or adventure with mercenaries from different places. They often camp here, so there was nothing to worry about. There were a lot of people here, so it was possible in a pinch to get lost in the crowd. They walked a little way into the interior of the place when they saw a strange man completely wrapped in a cloak who was sitting in the lotus posture and seemed to be meditating. One of their squad members shouted to the stranger to get out of here immediately. The chief merchant said it was fine. Everyone here is his own. Let him not be so impulsive. Xiang. With interest and disbelief, he looked towards the stranger. It continued to sit there unmoving, as if it was some kind of statue. There was some strange energy reeking from this non-acquaintance. It seems he had felt it somewhere before. The boy looked at the merchant, setting up camp in the most remote place, away from everyone. They're just asking to be attacked. The trader laughed. He knows, but there's nothing you can do about it. They don't communicate with each other with other groups, so there are no options. We can only hope that nothing happens during the night. They continued to move deeper into the depths. The sun was already nearing sunset, and its bright rays painted the variegated trees in warm colors. Wu shivered a little, and said that every time they came here he worried so much that he couldn't sleep. The guy looked at him in disbelief. Is this even a merchant or what? Soon night came. The moon came into the sky and lit everything bright blue. The tops of the trees were pointing straight up into the sky, creating a forest tent. All the members of the squad were asleep in the tent, the head merchant snoring through everything and wouldn't even notice the caravan passing by. His subordinate lay next to him as well. Xian sat on the crates of goods and surveyed his surroundings. His job was to keep watch over everyone else so they wouldn't be attacked while they slept. Frowning, he listened to the loud snoring coming from the tent. Who was it that said he couldn't sleep? That merchant is not only a coward but also a liar. There were a few more men armed with spears standing near the other tents. They were looking in the direction of the protagonist for some reason. Something is about to happen. Suddenly there was a loud whistling sound. Something like an arrow cut through the air with great speed and was coming straight towards them. Two huge arrows slammed straight into the bodies of the remaining guards, knocking them dead. The men didn't even have time to react, they just wheezed and fell to the floor. Xian closed his eyes and concentrated. The boy listened and prepared to repel the attack. A few seconds later, a large arrow flew towards him as well, but he reacted in time, and with one powerful blow of his hand, he knocked it aside. The arrow spun in a whirlwind and flew backwards. The protagonist shouted to the others to wake up immediately. They were under attack. The merchants woke up immediately, and for a few seconds they couldn't figure out what was going on. Xian jumped to his feet and grasped his sword. He had already realized that they would be attacked by some robbers, as expected. The guy prepared to defend. Literally out of the ground came a strange man who was armed with a long spear. He swung and prepared to strike the boy right in the forehead. Xian was already prepared for this. He drew his sword and began to energize it. Now he would quickly deal with this thief. The boy swung the ball, and immediately, many energy slashes appeared around him. Xian squinted his eyes. This thief was incredibly strong. Saint Master level. He was going to be a pain to deal with, but that was okay. The guy was ready for it. The other merchants had already woken up too. They grabbed their weapons. Wu shouted for everyone to be alert because they were under attack. Soon the rest of the bandits appeared as well. The merchant looked in their direction with a frightened look and realized that now they would not be able to avoid a skirmish. One of the bandits shouted that the boundless bandits had arrived, which meant they were all finished. In front of him stood several men armed to the teeth. They were dressed in furry clothes. Some had a bow, some had an axe. They looked more like cavemen. It seems these bandits were well known here since they often equipped in these places. A man shouted that if they didn't want to die, let them take their weapons and fight. The thieves started waving their weapons in different directions. The men screamed. They were caught off guard, and now the bandits only had to finish off the remnants. The thieves started waving their weapons in different directions. The men screamed. They were taken by surprise, and now the bandit had only to finish off the remnants. But suddenly something invisible repelled the attack. The axe flew a few centimeters from the merchant's face. He even smelled the metal. Xian. At this time was fighting with one of them. He looked down on him and shouted at him to get the people out of here. The situation stopped getting more and more dangerous. There were too many bandits, and apparently they were very strong opponents. The guy fought against this master. He said he would cover the others. Let them leave quickly. Wu Dai ordered all his men to get out of here immediately. The merchants grabbed their belongings, and with all their legs, they rushed to run away. They had to save their goods and their lives. One of the bandits swung his spear, and the protagonist barely had time to dodge. A powerful energy wave passed just a few centimeters from his face. He hadn't expected that this mere and thief would prove to be such a strong opponent. Besides, he wasn't alone. The man shouted that running away from them was very naive. Now they would definitely kill everyone. Xian Yu. There was nothing left but to use his sword technique. These people were incredibly strong. If he didn't fight at full strength, it would definitely get him killed. The boy applied an aerial move and jumped away from the pesky bandit to the side. The man didn't understand anything. Where did this kid go? The man gritted his teeth in anger. This kid is only a saint-level kid. Why can't he hit him? It was as if the protagonist was floating in the air. He didn't even need to touch the ground. As soon as the villain opened up to attack, the guy thrust his sword forward to pierce the freak in one fell swoop. The man dodged at the last moment. This was something he definitely didn't expect. This guy was incredibly fast. What's wrong with his speed? How can he be so strong? The men used a technique to get away. He was picked up by the vortex and carried a great distance away. He began tumbling through the air like a circus performer. What is that wind paraphernalia? The bandit stood some distance away from him, his body covered by the whirlwind of air. The boy realized that he couldn't hit this man even at full speed. What kind of strength does he have? Now he definitely needed to be dealt with. The bandit, who also didn't expect such a fight, didn't realize where this kid had come from. What's he doing here? Is he a mercenary? Why am I so strong? The man jabbed his finger at him and asked what just happened. How can he control the sword at such a high speed? Xian smirked. And was he surprised by what? What if he said that his sword could be even faster? The protagonist's weapon began to emit lightning bolts. He was storing more and more energy in it for a crushing blow. The criminal began to tremble with fear. He didn't expect such a repulse. How much faster? His knees shook and his breath hitched. Xian scowled such a face that he looked more like a beast. He grasped his sword and prepared to chop the bandit in half. The poor man ran with all his legs and screamed with fear. He had not expected to see such a thing, for he had thought that this boy was only a weakling, and now he was running away with all his might. Xian clutched his stomach with laughter. What a jerk. He hadn't laughed like that in a long time. The criminal noticed this and turned around on the guy. Is he mocking him? The man was furious. The bastard dared to mock him. He's going to chop him to pieces. The man is furious. How could this kid mock him like that? The man swung his spear and used the holy soldier stance. Now he's going to kill that little brat for daring to mock him. Xiang Yi ran in the opposite direction. He had no desire to fight that man. The robber at this time angrily yelled at him to stop. How could he run away from the battlefield? Xian Auburn turned around at him. He realized that this was the strongest opponent he had fought. For now, he wouldn't be able to defeat him due to the fact that his power wasn't enough. Therefore, it would be best to retreat. He tried to escape as stealthily as possible without attracting much attention. Where did Brother Wu Dai and the others go? We had to find them as soon as possible. Suddenly, he saw something. His gaze caught on something strange. The guy took a closer look. At a short distance, he saw a figure dressed in a hoodie, completely covering his body, cowering near the dead man. What is he doing there? The boy saw the stranger take out a purse with money. The stranger had happily fumbled for the money pouch and was now looking at it smilingly. They are nothing but miserable thieves. The protagonist ran up to him and grabbed the stranger's arm, preventing him from pocketing other people's money. The protagonist was furious. How dare this man even dare steal from the dead? This is looting. Suddenly, the stranger's hood pulled back, and the guy saw that it was actually a girl. Her face seemed vaguely familiar to him. The protagonist was stunned. What is she even doing here? Who was she? The guy continued to hold her hand and stared straight at her with an uncomprehending gaze. Is that a woman? Suddenly, she ripped his hand away and screamed that she was a man. Have him let her go immediately. Xian looked at her with incomprehension. What's she saying? Is she even normal? At this time, the bandit had already caught up with them, and waving his spear was coming closer and closer to them. Now he's going to see how that freak can run away. The man swung his axe and slammed it into the ground with all his might. The two men bounced just in time, and the axe hit the ground. The earth split open, and rocks flew in different directions. The man was furious. He swung his axe in an attempt to hit our heroes, but they skillfully dodged all his attack. The girl who was pretending to be a boy said she was just passing by. Maybe they'd better make a deal. It was obvious she was scared and didn't want to get into unnecessary conflict. The man was without mercy. He shouted that they were all going to die now. No one would leave here alive. It was obvious he had no intention of just backing down. He didn't want money, but human lives. The girl gritted her teeth. What bad luck. No one would believe her. She put out her hand and began to accumulate magical energy in it. In a few seconds, she had a huge sword in her hand. Well, he asked for it. This girl can concentrate holy power. This just keeps getting better and better. Suddenly, they were hit by a hail of energy from the sky. They stood below, not understanding anything. The same stranger, who was pretending to be a man, jumped high up and unleashed his full power upon them. The bandit laughed. It was another suicide bomber. He would definitely be dealt with in no time. The man jumped up and prepared to finish this insolent man off. Before he knew who he was facing, the man swung his spear and its blade passed a few centimeters away from the cloaked stranger's face. The girl ducked at the last moment and the blade passed within a few centimeters of her face. She gritted her teeth. This man's strength was at the level of a Saint Master. There might be a problem with that. The brigand swinging his spear threw lightning bolts in different directions. He would deal with this upstart first, and then deal with the others. The man was furious that some two brats dared to interfere with him. He swung his spear and the space around him began to distort. Waves of energy force flew in different directions, raising up whirlwinds of air. The girl held on with her last strength. It was very difficult for her to hold back such power. Her strength was already slowly leaving her body. She gritted her teeth and gathered the last of her will into a fist. The protagonist shouted to her that they had better unite against this man now. Alone, they would not be able to oppose him. The girl held her sword, holding back the blows of the spear. She panted and shouted, "Who the hell does he give up to? Let the guy back off, she could handle it herself." The girl held on with all her might, her face flushed red from the exertion. It was obvious how hard it was for her at that moment. The bandit laughed. Even if there are 10 of them, they are still no match for him. The protagonist jumped towards her and tried to repel the attack. It was necessary to cover this man, or else he would die now. Apparently, the odds were not equal. They stood opposite each other, and breathing heavily spoke. The boy said that if they didn't deal with this freak, he didn't think either of them would survive. "We need to stop bickering." The stranger folded his arms across his chest, and as if doing a favor said, "Well, since he insists, then so be it. He will accept his offer." Xian suddenly realized that this person's voice sounded more like a chicken. It didn't sound like a boy. It seemed like he had been tricked again. Wu, along with the rest of the merchants, were running away from countless bandits. He was screaming at the top of his lungs for someone to finally help him. The forces were uneven. They were about to be chopped to pieces. Suddenly, the guy went in the opposite direction, ordering the stranger to hold them off and he would be back soon. What? What the hell is he thinking? The girl just stared after him and shouted indignantly. She was furious that kid said they were going to team up. And then he took off the first chance he got. Now she was alone again against that creep. The criminal had his spear on his shoulder and was celebrating his victory. He realized he was about to cut everyone to pieces. The man pushed himself off the ground with such speed that it broke under his weight. He shouted that no one should be afraid. After he dealt with her, it was sure to avenge her. Contempt could be heard in his voice. The cloaked man began to concentrate magic again. He wanted to draw this as a last resort. But since this was the situation, he would have to act decisively. The forces were obviously uneven. He had to use his only trump. The girl threw back her hood, and it was clear to everyone already clear who she was. She looked forward with a confident look, holding onto the handle of her large ball. We would have to fight alone, there could be no mistake. At this time, the robber had already prepared to make one last strike to finally put an end to those pesky gnats. He swung his spear and launched an incredibly powerful energy wave towards the girl. It was impossible to dodge, but it wasn't that simple. The girl grasped her sword and jumped up high, ready to finish off the bastard once and for all. "Suck it!" she shouted, swinging her huge sword. She thrust the sword into the ground with incredible force. All the energy in it was transferred to the ground, and it began to fall to pieces. The bandit could hardly stay on his feet with such power. Suddenly he felt the earth behind him begin to break apart. Something was about to appear there. It was very familiar to him. The man wondered, could this be what he thought? Is this a combat skill? Could it be that this upstart has that kind of power? The ground behind his back began to split apart, and tongues of purple flames appeared from underneath. A few seconds later, a huge pillar of energy flames appeared behind her back. The girl stood there, while the power raged around her, and from afar it seemed that there was some incredible explosion. She looked askance at the bandit, and Riley asked if he still wanted to kill her and ask for a sign now he saw that she was not so simple. The man's mouth stretched in a wry smile. That's right, who would have thought it? He was greatly surprised. The man didn't expect that such a small child could have such power. It turns out she knows a martial skill. If he didn't have a Saint Master level, he would have probably died by now. He stood, and his body was enveloped by the fog from the explosion. The man was able to withstand such an attack, but still it made him stagger. The villain laughed. How interesting. If she gave him her combat skill, he would spare her. As it was, the man realized that the opponent was much stronger than he had anticipated. It would have to be a challenge to deal with him. And wasn't about to give up. She showed him the middle finger and said, "Dick, he them combat skill." The man went into a rage. How dare this little girl treat him like that? Now he would definitely wipe her into powder. He swung his spear. First, he decided to chop off her legs so that this brat wouldn't be able to escape. Anger raged inside the man. His pride was hurt. She looked forward fearfully. Now it looked like she was going to be finished. With her mind, she knew that she couldn't stand against such an opponent. But it was almost impossible to dodge such a high-speed attack. The man was about to bring his huge sword down on the helpless girl, when suddenly the main character appeared from somewhere and blocked the blow. There was a loud scraping of metal. The man clenched his teeth in anger. Once again, someone was in his way. When are those two little kids going to die? The girl looked at her sudden savior in surprise. Frightened and surprised, she asked, "Didn't he run away?" She thought he had left her to her fate. Suddenly, some merchants appeared from somewhere. They confirmed that, of course, the guy hadn't run away. He was just helping them. The other merchants confirmed they said it was the truth. Xian frowned and looked at his opponent. He said in a serious voice that they had agreed to unite, and he always keeps his word. Xian swung his weapon and shouted that this was the end of her work. Let her leave the rest to him. A column of energy flame erupted from his sword and immediately flew straight at the bandit. The man did not have time to dodge at the last moment, and the strongest wave knocked him off his feet, throwing him back a great distance. He barely managed to stay on his feet, that kid. What kind of strength does he have? He's never faced anything like this before. The man gripped the wooden hilt of his spear even tighter. It was truly gold now. It was time to end this. He would chop this little brat to pieces right now. The man used the combat skill he hoped to use to finish this little bastard off once and for all. In a split second, a huge energy tornado formed in the man's place and began to move forward, sucking in everything in its path. People began to panic and run for their lives. Qian stood firmly in his place. He stood in a fighting stance and prepared to repel the attack. A bunch of energy daggers flew at him from different directions, which were about to take his body through and through. The girl stood holding her sword and couldn't understand anything. Something incredibly scary was happening. The battle was serious, and she had almost no strength left. She had completely exhausted them. Xianwu stood at this time and prepared to repel the attack, swung his sword. Lightning bolts began to form around him, which spiraled into a vortex. He concentrated all his energy in one blow now, could not make a mistake. Otherwise, it would cost him his life. The guy tensed his whole body and swung his sword. There was an explosion of incredible power. From his weapon flew out a jet of pure energy, which at an incredible speed flew forward directly into his opponent. It was just some incredible power. I just could not possess it, ordinary man, even at the level of saint. The energy wave slammed straight into Tornado and pierced through him. The wind began to slowly subside, even the air itself electrified from such incredible power. The bundle of lightning pierced through the tornado. Xian was fully concentrated. The girl looked at him frightened and surprised. She didn't expect that this kid could possess such incredible strength. The main characters covered her with his body and began to reflect the energy daggers flying at them. The girl could not move from fear. The guy just stood like a rock. His body was impossible to move from the place he put forward his sword, and with each time reflected more and more blows. But unfortunately, even he wouldn't be able to handle such power. Still, he began to miss hits, the lightning bolts passing through his body, leaving serious wounds. There was something incredible going on around. From such a load, the body of the protagonist now seems to disintegrate into pieces. The girl suddenly realized something. Her eyes rounded with surprise, as if she recognized someone very long familiar. Xian crossed his arms and began to accumulate all the energy he was able to absorb. He was already exhausted, but he couldn't give up. It would be over in a little while. On his face were many cuts. His mouth was a thin trickle of blood, but the main hero did not give up. He smiled and winked at his rival. Now he's a dead man. The man stood there, and for a while he still couldn't understand what had happened to him. For a couple of seconds he couldn't feel anymore, but there was a huge through-hole in his chest from the incredible blow. The man stiffened and began to stammer. That blow had just pierced him through and through. He couldn't believe it. A kid who seemed to have just graduated from high school yesterday had given him such competition. And now the experienced robber was dying from a single blow. Xian exhaled, relieved. He had just relied on luck, and he was unspoken lucky. His body was pierced by an incredible pain a second later. The overload was monstrous, and of course he wouldn't be able to stay on his feet for so long. The guy was about to faint. He coughed and blood spurted from his mouth. It felt as if his body was being struck by lightning. The guy coughed harder and harder. His body couldn't take the overload, and now he was on the verge of death because of the overload. The girl picked up his weakened body, preventing him from falling. The protagonist held onto his chest and tried to regain consciousness. It was hard for him to breathe. His heart was barely beating. She measured his pulse. His heartbeat was barely perceptible. She frowned and looked at the boy. He had forcibly increased his holy power for that blow. His internal and external damage is very serious. We need to hospitalize him immediately, the girl shouted angrily. And what kind of idiot would just sacrifice himself like that? The girl was furious. How could anyone act so recklessly? Xian smiled, and in his usual sarcastic manner he said that if he didn't do it, they would only die. Nothing of the sort. She looked at him spitefully and frowned even more. But then her gaze softened, curiosity in it. She asked him why he had saved her. He doesn't know her at all, and she was a marauder. Xianis proudly looked at her and answered, like he said, he did his job. Just let her trust the rest to him, including keeping it safe. Suddenly, after saying those words, he received a hard blow to his side. The stranger didn't seem to share his bravado. He's not badly bedded, so he's all right. The guy could barely keep his feet up without falling over. Xian rubbed the bruised area and said resentfully that he was really saying what he thought. He wasn't embellishing at all. In the background, the merchants were still running away from the remnants of the bandits. The stranger looked at the protagonist with contempt and distrust. One of the bandits noticed that their boss had been killed after all, the older brother of the dead one. A look of horror appeared in their eyes. How could this be possible? The bandits began to look at each other fearfully. Some of them had tears in their eyes. They couldn't believe it. Their leader was dead. Now the situation became more complicated. Xian cast a disdainful glance in their direction. It turns out that man was their boss. His strength justified that title. He had to mess around with that asshole to finally finish him off. As always, another sparkling thought came at the last moment. A satisfied smile stretched across his face. Now he was going to do something wonderful. Xian adopted a threatening stance. The boy shouted to the bandit that their lousy brother had been killed. Now it became their turn. The bandits rushed over frightened. They screamed in fear. We had to get away. If that kid killed the boss, they're no match for him. What a devil. They're not ready to die. We should have gotten out of there. The rest of the guards had already prepared to repel the attack, but they were surprised to see the bandits running away. How did they escape? So now everyone would be alive. The men breathed a sigh of relief. Their lives were saved. Wu looked at them. Some of the guards were exhausted and were just lying on the ground. The man shouted in a serious tone that although they were able to fight back this time, it was only a few of the boundless bandits' strength. His voice sounded frightened and worried. To prevent the others from still reaching them, we need to set off as soon as possible. The man clenched his fist. He looked as anxious as possible. Xian nodded in agreement. This man was right. It was necessary to leave this place. He wasn't going to die in this backwater. He was already sick to death of fighting with these offspring. 76. He looked at his recent acquaintance and said that he was going to the Blue Wind Kingdom with these people. But what would this boy do? At this time, the stranger was just searching the bodies of the slain bandits. Smiling, he said that it just so happened that he was also heading there, so he would keep them company that way. He happily took the gold coins from the corpses and put them in a small pouch for himself. The protagonist looked at him with distrust. There was something about this man he didn't like. Xian told him that everyone had seen his fighting skill. If the news spread, it would not be good for him. The boy stood up and turned his back to him. He said that none of this matters. He is not afraid of it. He turned to the main character as if remembering something and held out his hand to him. The guy looked at her in surprise. What did he want? John pondered, and what does he need to do? What is this guy waiting for? It finally came to him. Maybe he wants to get acquainted. The protagonist shook his hand good-naturedly and told him his name. It was a pleasure to meet him. The boy didn't seem to share his enthusiasm. He slapped him on the palm of his hand and shouted, "Why does he need that handshake? He burned his cloak because of him, so let him give him his money back." The protagonist looked at him with astonishment. What is this even about? Xian smiled and scratched the back of his head. The boy looked at him and asked curtly, he wouldn't deny it, right? He smiled and said there was no problem with that. But first he would like to know the stranger's name. The boy sighed and said to keep it in mind. He proudly pointed at himself and said that his name was Mu Yun. It was still unclear whether it was a boy or a girl. It all looked as strange as possible. Soon they approached the city. Many other merchants were at the gate entrance. The carts were pulling in behind the fortress, and the merchants were ready to sell their wares. It was their only income. The protagonist sat in the cart and meditated while cultivating. His new acquaintances watched it all from the side and said with interest that it was a very interesting way of cultivating. May he teach it to him. The boy replied that it was a family technique which he was forbidden to pass on to anyone. Boy, this was offensive. The Blue Wind Kingdom is known as a mercenary kingdom, so there are a lot of orders here. They walked up to a large board that had many pictures of people on it. There seemed to be a bounty on the heads of these people. The protagonist scrutinized the board. The people on this board are worth a lot. Yunus looked at it with admiration, and already he was anticipating how much money could be made from all this. Suddenly, the protagonist's eye caught on something very, very familiar. Something he had seen in the distant past. His eyes widened and his heart felt as if it had skipped a beat. On the plaque hung the same old man he had fought back in the distant past, in his past life. It was a face he would recognize out of 1,000. The old man's face stared back at him angrily from the bulletin board. His face was the same as it had been that day, angry and not boding well. The wagons with traders continued to arrive in the city. The people were already crowded there. It seems that there was a small queue. It was still a challenge to get into the city. Yoon asked the protagonist what surprised him so much. He must have noticed how excited and surprised he looked at the order board. Xian pointed his finger at that old man and asked if he knew the man. The guy looked incredibly excited, as if he had seen something he had been waiting for a long time. The boy leaned back and indifferently said that of course he knew. It was the lonely old man. Xian, I guess that was his nickname. He pounced on the boy and grabbed his hands. He asked him, "Where is this old man now?" The boy was frightened by this reaction and just couldn't do anything. He didn't expect his companion to be so abnormal. Yun Yi said that if he knew everything, he would tell all the information to the mercenaries. Xian continued to hold on to his shirt and looked at him pleadingly. The boy smilingly asked, was he that interested in the reward? He advises him to surrender. In terms of strength, they are far behind this man. Xian looked at him with a serious look and asked, how much does he know about this person? Any information is important to him right now, and this kid turned out to be smart. He said that if that person wanted more information, let them pay. What a small-minded bastard, is it hard to say that? There was nothing left but to pay this little impudent. The protagonist threw his bag of gold and asked in a rough voice, "Is this enough?" The boy accepted the payment and began to examine the shiny coins. With a satisfied smile, he began to narrate. The boy said that the lonely old man is a very powerful man who appeared out of nowhere in the Blue Wind Kingdom over 10 years ago. He only cares about killing, so he quickly became the #1 target for all mercenaries. Xian pensive more than 10 years ago comes out. So it happened when they both died, right? But why did he become a child and this battery remained the same? That's the first mystery, Yoon continued to narrate. Later, his location became unknown, and all information about him became a state secret, and was hidden by the mercenary union. The different cities still have a charge on him, which means he is still alive. Xian was surprised. A state secret. Apparently it was a serious matter. He looked at his new acquaintance with interest. So only people from the mercenary union have access to this information. The boy shook his head. No, it's not like that. Yoon leaned on the side and said, only the top people of the mercenary union have access to this information. A very limited number of people know this. 109 Xian book literally burst into flames at this idea. So if he wanted to get information about this old man, he would have to become one of the top mercenaries. Yun nodded his head. Right. Also, he had heard that the lonely old man was looking for a person named Jiang Chen. And then the protagonist felt as if he had been hit on the head. Jiang Chen. So the old man wants to find him. At this time, Yun was admiring his bag of money. It seemed that this boy didn't care about anything but making money. No wonder, he's a mercenary after all. At that moment, the protagonist made a firm decision. We have to find him. Maybe he knows how they ended up in this world and he can figure out how to get back to his life. At this time, moved through the center of the city. Soon they arrived at their destination. They were greeted by a magnificent gate that towered going high into the sky. Wu said goodbye to them and said that he had to take the caravan to the Chamber of Commerce. So that was the end of their journey. The protagonist said goodbye to his employer. Yun snapped his fingers and said that he too needs to get out of here, so goodbye. He was about to leave when suddenly the protagonist stopped him by grabbing his shoulder. Stop. He still has a favor to ask of him. The guy turned around frightened and gritted his teeth. He was already starting to simply get pissed off at this prying. What else is it? If he wanted to, he had to pay. Did he even have any money left? Xian X said that he didn't have any money left, but he knew where to get a couple coupons. As soon as the boy heard this, excitement and curiosity flashed across his eyes. Coupons. Soon they arrived at the agreed-upon place. In a few minutes, they stood in front of a large, beautiful building, more like some fine restaurant. When they opened the doors, they saw the poor decoration of the room. It looked much more aesthetically pleasing from the outside. There were rags everywhere, and the smell was unbearable. It must have been some kind of local eatery. As soon as they stepped inside, they were immediately stared at with disgruntled and distrustful looks. The people here were strange and even dangerous. It seemed like every single one of them was a former criminal. Their faces were as if they were ready to kill them at this very moment. Yun, surprised, looked at his companion. Wasn't this his first time in this kingdom? So how does he know about this tavern? The protagonist replied that back at the camp, he heard the mercenaries talking about the favorite place of the bad guys of this town. They approached the bar, and the protagonist told his companion to take a seat for now and let him order something to drink and he would be right back. Yoon leaned on the bar and ordered a glass of water, but he did so with a look as if he were ordering a strong sake. The bartender took the order and began to fumble under the bar in search of a glass. The atmosphere here was unpleasant to say the least. There was shouting everywhere and a drunken balaganza. The food here was apparently disgusting and the odor was even worse. Two men sitting at a table were laughing loudly and singing liquor. Protagonists walked over to one of the tables where several people were already sitting and apparently playing some kind of game of chance. 100 gold coins for Puze, said one of the people present. The guy added, and 150 gold coins for Ralph? The men turned around on him and looked at him with angry glances. Who is this guy? And what does this kid want? Let him get out of here before they get angry. Xian smiled and repeated the question. What does he want? At this moment he looked as threatening as possible, befitting the contingent here. He smiled and said they were getting out his coupons. The guy was smiling some kind of crazy smile that would make anyone's knees shake. Yun was sitting at the bar drinking his glass of water when suddenly the sounds of fighting came to his ears. The bartender listened too, and looked in that direction. A moment later, pushing the rags aside, the protagonist came out. On his back, he dragged these two guys. They appeared to be unconscious. The protagonist seems to have finished them off very badly. 131. He threw the breathless bodies of the bandits on the ground, and his companion looked in that direction with horror. What the hell is going on here anyway? He approached the bartender and told him that from the city wall he had found only these two. Is there enough reward from them to pay for it? Everyone got up from their seats and looked at him fearfully. Something strange was about to happen. Xian stretched into an even bigger smile. He began to run his eyes over everyone present. If not, he could look for a couple more suitable options. Everyone present apparently took the hint. Oh shit. The guys got scared and started packing up to get the hell out of here. No one wanted to be victimized by this stranger who had somehow found out everything about them and was now a danger. In a few seconds, the diner was completely empty, with only the two protagonists left. Yun stood looking at his glass of water. It seems that he even turned green from fear. Running out of the establishment, the brigands shouted that there was no reward for them. Let him just leave them alone. They will become decent people, just let him spare them. After seeing this, Yoon approached the bartender and suddenly said that he should pour him something stronger than water. The bartender looked at him in surprise, but accepted the order. He sighed heavily. After completing the mercenary union's missions and accumulating enough merit, you can be promoted. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. Is there any way to accumulate those merits quickly? The boy pondered for a moment. He hummed and said that he should first visit the mountain range of magical beasts, as there were a lot of quests there. Also, the first ancient monsters appeared in that place. Xian even hadn't finished drinking his drink, and had already put his glass on the table with a clatter. At this moment, he made his final decision. After wiping his mouth, he smiled and squinting his eyes said that they would immediately move forward. The decision was final and irrevocable. Now a long and dangerous road awaited them. The guys were walking fast on the rocky terrain. The road ahead of them was long, full of danger and new adventures. They had to be well prepared. Soon they stopped at the big mountain. They looked down with a gaze all the nearby space. The view from here was truly beautiful. The forest raged below, with a beautiful bird in the clouds. Xiang noisily sucked in air with his nose and began to admire the beautiful views. So this is the mountain range of magical beasts? It turns out to be very beautiful here. His companion looked at the map and said, the scenery here is really something, but they get bored quickly. Yun revealed the map and said he clarified, he is only here to guide him and provide information. Hunting and killing monsters is his job. If he wants the boy to help him, it will have to be paid extra. The protagonist grimaces. Yes, he's already figured it out. He just needs someone who knows enough about the mountain range to guide him. The boys began to scrutinize the map. The most valuable quest was in this place, the hunt for the silver-striped golden snake. But it is very rare, and its power is terrifying, so it is not worth it. The monsters on this map were divided into different ranks. For starters, Yun advised the protagonist, this one, hunt 10 phantom mice. Although it's difficult, the reward is very high and is considered a great merit. The protagonist sighed in. Good. Since that's the case, he'll listen to a professional. Though trust he didn't have any confidence in him. Yun stretched in some sort of strange smile, which in all likelihood did not bode well. The boy said that of course he should obey. The boys were walking along a forest path. The sun was shining all around. The weather was beautiful and the mood was elevated by it. Yun began to tell about the object of their hunt. The phantom mouse inhabits this area. Their specialty is that they are transparent, and there is only one way how to find them. Does the boy want to find out? The protagonist nodded his head without much interest, and naturally he heard the already familiar answer. His companion smilingly replied, then you'll have to pay. Xian rolled his eyes. What a bastard. This guy was starting to piss him off. The protagonist couldn't take it anymore. He advised this task, but really just want to fight him for more money. Yoon replied with an important look that it's just called business. Why is he angry? Xian averted his gaze to the side as if he saw something there. His gut never failed him, and right now something was approaching him. The boy quickly drew his sword, and immediately something was thrust at him. There was a crunch as if someone's bone had broken. To everyone's surprise, his ball had the same phantom bat on it. The guy caught it without much difficulty. Yun was just shocked. He couldn't believe his eyes. After all, these bats are quite rare creatures, and it's very difficult to catch them. How did he do it? Xian smiled with a full mouth. If he wanted to find out, who would he have to pay? What a good idea to use his own weapons against his enemy. Yun crossed his arms on his chest resentfully and shook his head. Not that it interested him very much. The protagonist at this time was triumphant. He laughed loudly while swinging the bat worn on his sword. Yun crouched on the nearest rock. He didn't move. Since he had his own way of hunting mice, let him hurry up and get it over with. He won't wait long for the protagonist. Okay, it's done. The boy started jumping in different directions with incredible speed and catching the bats one by one. The beasts had no time to run away from him, and soon he had enough. Yun watched him. He had envy inside. This guy has a lot of interesting tricks up his sleeve, so he was also interested in the old man. Maybe they know each other. Suddenly a hunch popped into the boy's head. Wait a minute, is what he's thinking true? A horrible hunch pierced his head. His body began to tremble as if in fear. Perhaps this kid is the son of a lonely old man. That's simply impossible. The boy held his head and began to tremble even more with fear. It was the first time he had ever been so badly frightened. Xian head to his side and stared at the boy with astonishment. Now it was clear why he had insisted on coming here. It was all to find his father. Yun was already completely lost in his own conjecture. He was trembling with fear and didn't know where to put himself. Xiang looked at him in surprise. Why was this kid looking at him like that? Suddenly it was as if something realized something. He opened his eyes wide and froze in place. Xian suddenly transformed. His stance became menacing, and he looked menacingly at his companion holding the ball in his hands. It seemed that the kid suspected something. Yun noticed this and shook even more violently with fear. He saw his companion take out a sword and start charging it with magical energy. What is he doing? Is he going to kill him to keep him quiet? That's not Wei's thoughts. The boy waved his hands. Xian quickly ran towards him, waving his weapon. It looked like he wanted to kill his companion. The poor guy shouted, stammering that he wouldn't tell anyone about this. But to everyone's surprise, the protagonist ran past him and swung his sword, stabbed somewhere backwards. There was a strange sound. The sword had hit somewhere after all. Finally realized that the target wasn't him. Xian jumped back and immediately a hissing sound was heard from behind, as if there was a huge snake. Xian bounced back. This thing had an incredibly strong recoil. He held onto his sword with both hands and prepared for the next attack. His companion stood and tried to recover. The snake did not waste a second and rushed to attack its prey. It did not want to miss such a tasty meal in the form of two guys. Mu Yun pulled his eyes out and couldn't move from his seat. Devil, that snake is incredibly strong. He grasped his sword and it burst into bright flames. Yun swung it around and sparks from the fire flew in all directions. And it seemed his element was fire. We had to defend ourselves against this thing or it would eat them all. Now the boys stood back to back and prepared for battle. Yun asked his companion did he see anything. The protagonist replied that no, it all happened too fast. Meanwhile, the snake was approaching its prey. It circled around the boys. On its back was something like a bone comb, and the scales were all gold in color. It's that rare golden snake. Xian together and his comrade realized at this moment that they were in mortal danger. What a devil. They definitely couldn't handle this thing. It was that golden snake with silver stripes. A huge serpent appeared as if from the ground. It spun around, creating whirlwinds out of thin air. The snake looked at its prey with white eyes. It felt that these two could do nothing to it. Compared to this monster, the two guys were just tiny. The snake began to crawl closer to them so that it could swallow both of them in one fell swoop. As soon as it crawled close enough, the boys realized how huge it was after all. Now fear and doubt settled in their souls that they would be able to handle this monster after all. It looked incredibly threatening. 179 Yun Na frowned, he said, doubting how he should think, whether or not they were lucky enough to encounter the golden snake. The guy realized that the battle wouldn't be easy. The protagonist took a closer look and said, "If judging by the size, it is a silver-striped golden snake of the second rank, and the one he cast off the first." Yun was frightened and surprised at the same time. That is, the guy wants to say that there is more than one snake here. Xian smiled and squinted his eyes, ready to hunt. Looks like it. So unless they want to become its lunch, they should run away from here as soon as possible. Yun, scared, looked at him and asked if he had a plan. He still had the last bit of hope that the guy would save them all because he didn't know what to do. Xian got up from his seat and ran. Lastly, he said that he would divert the attention of those things, and Yun let him use his combat skill to clear their path. Yun started to get indignant. He was actually asking for okay, not directions. But the protagonist didn't listen to him and was already running at full speed to distract the snakes. The beast opened its big golden eye and noticed the protagonist, who was rapidly running towards her. Such was the luck, the prey itself running into its jaws. The snake bared its teeth and prepared to swallow the little boy. But the protagonist did not think of retreating. He ran straight ahead towards the terrible monster. After a few seconds, the distance between them decreased, and the boy took out his holy sword as hard as he could hit the snake right in the nose. The monster bared its teeth. She had not expected her prey to resist. Xian physically felt a powerful recoil. His entire body felt as if it was vibrating after the impact. He didn't expect that the scales were so hard that he couldn't even leave a scratch on it. He bounced to the opposite side and with a ducking base. It was necessary to save its life. He alone could not handle it. The monster shook his head, and the guy landed just a few meters away from him. The monster only got angry from such a blow and prepared to finish the boy off. The creature racked its head in different directions, trying to bring itself to its senses. But it wasn't that simple. The boy suddenly noticed that this snake was splitting into several pieces. His eyes widened with horror and realization of the hopelessness of the situation. The door, several energy clots flew towards him. The snake had split into several parts and was now attacking from different directions. At the last moment, the protagonist applied his shield, and all three energy snakes hit him. The shield crackled from such a strain. It seemed that the earth was about to break and the guy would fall into its very depths. Xian shouted to his comrade to immediately use the spell, or else they would both be finished. Yun, already prepared to attack, he shouted that he understood everything and swung his flaming sword. He was literally engulfed in a whirlwind of fire energy and was ready to deliver his crushing blow. The boy didn't notice anything, but a sharp snake tail was already moving at him from the back. One more second and his body would be pierced through. The boy wouldn't have had time to react anyway. He noticed it too late and watched in horror as the huge snake tail approached him at an unimaginable speed. There would be nothing he could do now, but simply await his fate. The tail wrapped around his body in a split second. The serpent gripped him tightly and began to squeeze him harder and harder with every second. He screamed to the protagonist that another snake had grabbed him. He can't get out. The tail clamped down harder and harder with each passing second. The poor guy's mouth was already spurting blood. The tip of the tail aimed right at his head to pierce it in a split second. The guy screamed and started to pass out. Xian was fighting the main snake at this time. He saw at the last moment how his friend was in the snake's tenacious grip. But unfortunately, there was no way he could help him, as he himself had many problems with these creatures. The protagonist swung his sword in his hand. He couldn't leave his comrade in such a situation. He had accumulated enough power, and now it was necessary to try to summon him somehow. Xian concentrated his energy and released an energy wave with his sword right into the monster's tail to free his friend. However, the snakes were too many. The guy did not have time to calculate the action of the monster, and it Razinu in its huge mouth was already approaching him from the back. The poor fellow pulled his arm forward in an attempt to break free, but the snake's jaws were already too close. There was no way he would be able to break free. The snake's jaws snapped shut and there was a crunch of breaking bones. Its teeth sank right into his flesh. The guy clenched his teeth from the incredible pain. He tried hard not to scream. The snake had caught its prey after all. Yun was struggling to hold on. The snake's tail was being pulled tighter and tighter. Soon his body would simply not be able to withstand it. But suddenly, the main character's sword stabbed straight into the snake's flexible body, piercing through it. The sword stabbed right into the scales, and even though it was very strong, it still managed to penetrate it. There was a crunching sound, and shards of light flew in different directions. Yun was already holding on with all his might. One more second and his body would be flattened. What did he save him for? Now none of them would leave alive. Xian already felt something viscous begin to rapidly spread through his body. It was snake venom. It slowly filled the entire space, displacing the blood. They're partners, and he's not going to let his partner die in front of him. The snake tossed its victim high up and opened its mouth to swallow him in one fell swoop. There was no longer any strength left in the body of the protagonist. The poison was beginning to take effect. He could not move a thing. Xian was falling straight into the mouth of the monster. His consciousness began to fade. For a second, he became unbearably dreary at the thought. He was now flying into the snake's mouth, and in a few seconds, he would die. The guy almost cried. He didn't think he would die so miserably. His face was already slowly starting to change color. The snake venom had already slowly started to spread, filling his entire body. Suddenly, the guy felt a strange sensation. His body could hardly feel anymore. His eyes were closing and his consciousness was slowly leaving his exhausted body. What was this feeling? He'd never felt this before. Ambient. Can he see without his eyes? In front of his eyes, even though they were closed, vague silhouettes shrouded in fire began to appear. It turns out that even though his eyes were completely shut down, he could feel, and his senses sharpened. He could sense the world around him without even using his eyes. His saint force had just become several times more powerful. A second later, the jungle had a crushing explosion. Bundles of light saint energy flew in different directions. It seemed that even the neighboring state was affected. The guy suddenly felt that he had become much stronger. His body rose upwards and began to emit lightning like a thunderous sky. Even the air started to become electrified. The snake looked up, still waiting to catch its prey. Yun looked at his comrade with surprise. Is this a breakthrough? The snake was still squeezing his body, but suddenly it loosened its grip so that the guy already was able to breathe. The sword that was stuck into his body began to glow with a purple light, and wisps of lightning also began to burst out from it. The weapon, as well as the protagonist's body, was transformed. It had gained incredible power. The sword burst out of the snake's tail and immediately rushed in the opposite direction. Yun just stunnedly watched all of this. He couldn't believe it. His eyes looked like they were deceiving him. But it was all true. Yun, with his own eyes, he saw the sword move with itself right towards the head of the terrifying serpent. That was Jian Chen's sword. It was simply unbelievable. The spirit sword gained its true power. It began to cut through space, moving at a speed that a human brain wouldn't be able to see it. The snake opened its eyes wide and watched as the weapon approached it. It had to get out of here. Mentally, the monster realized that it was about to be finished, but he could no longer do anything. Even with a great desire, the sword at great speed crashed into his neck. Even the hard scales that I could not penetrate any weapon forbade under such pressure. Blood splashed in different directions. The scales were pierced and a horrible wound appeared on the monster's body. The snake roared with more nudging in its sharp fangs. Xian still couldn't see, but he felt that he had managed to wound the laughter after all. With some sixth sense, he saw a wound forming on the snake's body. Even if he died, he would take that thing with him to the other world. His body was overflowing with energy. His spiritual power increased several times, so that even though he was blind, he could see everything. The sword continued to swirl around the snake, cutting its scales like paper. The beast could do nothing. It was completely powerless against such a colossal weapon. But that was just the beginning. The sword spun around the snake's entire body like a spiral, slicing it apart. The snake screamed in pain but could do nothing. Yun still being held captive by this creature, he couldn't believe his eyes. A sword flying by itself? This was simply unbelievable. He looked at it all with genuine surprise and delight. Is this person also like this? Xian patiently waited. He watched from the sidelines as his weapon chopped the snake apart by itself. With only a few moments left, this snake would finally die. The snake roared, emitting a death rattle. Its body was completely shredded by the sword. Blood spatters were flying in different directions, and the protagonist was in the air looking down on it. Maybe this body is as hard as stone, but what about this one? The protagonist pointed his sword straight at the snake's head. His weapon took only a fraction of a second to reach its target. There was a long scream and a crunch of bones. The sword hit its target. Its blade pierced through the snake's head before it could do anything. The wounded body began to emit black smoke from its wounds. The snake roared, its death rattle echoing through the neighborhood. Thick black smoke billowed from the horrible creature's mouth. The protagonist looked at all this and in his heart rejoiced he had succeeded after all. The effects of the poison gradually began to dissipate. His vision returned and the boy opened his eyes. He sighed heavily. Victory was in his pocket. Yun stood on the ground and looked at his friend in surprise. He couldn't believe his eyes. This man had won. But the question remained, who was he? The boy's eyes widened with surprise. He saw something terrible, his pupils narrowed with fear. The protagonist exhausted by the battle down at a great speed. One more second, and then the body just crashes to the hard ground. Yun watched the whole thing and prepared to run to his friend's aid. He couldn't leave it like this. One more second and he would die. A second later, the main character's body flashed like an arrow and fell into the thicket of trees. The branches cracked. Eyes slowly began to open. The body was all weakened and more spread just throughout his body. The boy was breathing heavily, his eyes twitching convulsively. Yun standing nearby, his face, it was the first thing the protagonist saw after waking up. The boy looked at him fearfully. He was finally awake. He stood up a little and sat up. Surprised, he looked at his savior and asked, "And how come he's perfectly fine?" The boy blanched. Yun reached for a small glowing ball. A golden snake core with a silver stripe works as well as the antidote. Xian smiled and said that this was his best skill, and he hoped that what happened would only remain between them. The guy still couldn't believe that he was so strong that he was able to kill a silver-striped golden snake. What's the name of this skill? Yun started gibbering. He said that's right, he remembered. He just doesn't want everyone to know that he's the son of a lonely old man. The main character looked at him in surprise. What's he talking about? And what the hell was he freezing up about now? How did he become his son? Yun smiled and said that it was obvious. He's the son of a lonely old man and don't even let him try to hide it. Xian looked at him with an annoyed look. But the guy continued to speak. The flying sword is a famous technique of the old man, and he wants to say that he is to me, his son, ask for a sign. The protagonist continued to stare at him with an uncomprehending look. So it turns out that when the old man tried to enter this world and succeeded, he learned the spirit ball. I see. Yun didn't stop. His eyes glittered with lust for profit. The guy said that since he came to his senses, he should gut this snake. She's a valuable treasure after all. The guy started looking at the snake's body with enthusiasm. They needed to cut it open and get all the magic cores out. It could fetch a fortune. He felt surges of saint power, but he never imagined that he would stumble upon such a rich harvest. This is the most authentic silver-striped golden snake. Looks like luck is on his side. The boys turned around at the unfamiliar voices and looked in his direction in surprise. Who the hell was that? A strange man in blue clothes was approaching them. The man smiled, a large scar on his face. He looked at the two guys, and in his eyes was nothing but endless lust for profit. He didn't see the two guys in front of him, but his victims. Suddenly, several more men in dark robes appeared from the forest. The man appeared to be their leader. He said the snake belonged to him. He stood in front of the boys and looked at them with a vicious stare. They were just a barrier to his enrichment, and it was necessary to deal with him as quickly as possible. Xian smiled and said that he could take the snake away. But how was he going to deal with them? The man raised his hands to the sky and said theatrically, "There is such a beautiful scenery around. Just a beautiful place to die, don't they think?" His henchmen clapped their hands. Xian Rasupena faded his eyes. And why are all the villains so unoriginal? He was already hoping for something interesting to happen here. They said it together. It was hard to tell who said it first. The guys were surprised and looked at each other with a smile. Who said it first? The situation was comical. Yun was determined. Since they were able to kill the silver-striped golden snake, isn't this person afraid that Hash redo its fate? The man smirked maliciously. Good joke, one of them has almost no light power left and the other is badly injured. How do they plan on killing them? After all, there are simply more of them. The man shouted at the top of his voice. How are they going to scare them? They're just brats. Just two kids who don't know anything about the outside world. A holy sword suddenly materialized in the man's hands. He smiled and gloatingly thanked them for helping him kill that snake. Now they would die here and now. The man swung his sword. The people standing behind him prepared to attack. They realized that these two simply couldn't handle them. Victory was almost within their grasp. Yun, he's going to try to hold them off, and the main character. Let him run away from here, the guy asked. But how is he going to get away by himself? After all, there's just more of them. He won't be able to confront them all by himself after all. His comrade replied not to worry about him. He has enough aces up his sleeve without a dead weight. Escaping from here won't be a problem. Xian understood and gave an angry look. And who did he call dead weight? What a joke, the guy was furious. Yun said that the main character had almost no holy power left. How could he be useful? He was in command before, and now it was his turn. The protagonist gritted his teeth in anger. He didn't like that some guy perch unknowingly from where he came from was starting to command here. Who the hell is he? He didn't want to give up so easily. He had worked so hard to kill the snake. How can he just give it to these bastards? Begging sign guy put his hand forward and began to accumulate holy energy in it. His friend wondered, does he want to do what he's thinking? A second later, the holy sword was in the hands of the protagonist. Among them, only that old man is a danger. The rest of them are all just cronies. Dealing with them will be easy. Yun turned around at him and asked, how is he going to fight when his saint force is only enough for this knife? Xian looked at him in disbelief and said that he would see for himself now. There was no need to jump to conclusions. Xian ordered him to deal with their boss and he would take on the others. His friend nodded in agreement. They put their swords forward, ready to fight back. Yun used his attack skill, his body beginning to be covered in fire. Now he needed to concentrate all his strength to deal with this old man in one fell swoop. He could be a big problem in the future. The boy gripped his sword tightly and swung with all his might. A fire aura began to appear around him, enveloping his entire body. The old man was completely confident in his victory. He smiled and said that this kid was just a fool who didn't know when to surrender. Now he's going to die. Well, he had chosen that fate. Yun ran up to the old man in an instant and struck him with his sword. But the old man drew his weapon and skillfully blocked the blow. It seemed to pose no threat to him. Xiangai didn't pay any attention to their taunts at all at this time, stood opposite the others, and held his small sword in his hands. The black-clothed people laughed with loud laughter. That's it. He wants to fight them alone. But the guy didn't pay any attention to them. He just concentrated the energy in his dagger. To him, these words were nothing more than empty sound. He knew that soon all these people would just die. But those freaks wouldn't stop. What's wrong? He's so scared he decided to close his eyes. But the guy didn't see anything but his target. He felt with his sixth sense every move they made, every breath they took. After the amplification, all of his senses sharpened, and now he could wield the spiritual sword even with such a small amount of saint power. The battle with that serpent was what went in his favor. These lousy mercenaries are no match for him. He jumped high up and used the spiritual sword. The guy swung his dagger and prepared to chop these miserable scum in an instant. The small dagger, despite its size, flew at a tremendous speed straight at one of the mercenaries. The man was holding onto his axe and didn't understand anything. Death flashed in his eyes for a second. He had already accepted his fate. There was no way the man could have expected that a guy with so little strength could be so threateningly strong. It was only a fraction of a second, and the mercenaries had already been cut by the energy blades in an instant, before they could even blink an eye. Blood splattered in different directions. People didn't even have time to react. Their lives were cut short at the same moment. Xian standing and looking down on them, he saw people squirming from the field and stretching their hands towards him. But to him, those screams were music. He massacred them in a split second. But at this time, his friend of the city was fighting the most important. Their strength was almost equal. He easily parried all the attacks of the old man, not letting him even get close to him. The scraping of metal rang out. The battle promised to be bloody. The old man noticed how one of these guys chopped his entire entourage in 1 second. That's impossible. He shouldn't have even a drop of saint power left. How could he even move? Yun saw this too and happily laughed. Xian stood holding onto his little dagger. Dying in the middle of such a delightful scenery really sounded good. In front of him lay a pile of the corpses of the mercenaries he had just killed. He turned to the old man and asked him. He doesn't think so. In his opinion, this is the perfect place to finally die. The old man frowned. He realized that he had underestimated these suckers too much. However, not enough to come up with a backup plan. The old man shouted that it was time to act, and suddenly, from the thick of the forest, 2 fiery arrows flew at them. They were aimed straight at the protagonists. They moved with such speed that it was almost impossible to catch their movement. Yun reacted quickly and swung his sword to repel the attack. The arrow hit the blade and flew in the opposite direction with a loud sound. Xian displayed his weapon and also repelled the attack. Was there another Saint Master here? Now that was a big problem. They wouldn't be able to fight together against 2 experienced masters. But surprisingly, the old man didn't attack. He just ran away in the opposite direction. What kind of fighter is that? Is he really that weak? The protagonist shouted to run right after him. The old man was running away at this time, and Yun ran after him, swinging his sword. It was obvious that the old man was definitely very frightened, and he tried to run away as fast as possible because these 2 could kill him, and he didn't want to lose his life. But instead of chasing the old man, the main character stood like a stumbling block and just looked at him with an angry look. He felt something change in his body. There was pain everywhere. Yun turned around to him and shouted, "What's the matter? Why is he standing still? What is even happening?" But suddenly his eyes widened with fear. He saw something that made him flinch. There was clearly something wrong with his friend. At that moment, he'd already spat on the old man. Xian lay on the ground, completely exhausted. This fight had completely exhausted him, and now he was lying there unable to move a finger. The day continued. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the nearby grove where the incredible battle was taking place. Yun, with a frightened face, rushed to his aid. What's wrong with his friend? Why is he suddenly lying unconscious? Is he really dead? The guy opened his eyes with the last of his strength and started muttering something to himself. He said he had no idea what had happened. His eyes suddenly went black and he felt dizzy, and then he slumped to the ground. Yun assumed that all of this could be because of another light master. The guy already rose to his feet, rubbing his aching head. No, the problem was him. He had used up too much saint power, now he had almost no strength left. But the guy wouldn't stop worrying. The protagonist rubbed his head and said that it was fine. No need to worry. His comrade had little faith in that after all. The protagonist looked really bad. Even suddenly a small purple fire lit up in the protagonist's hands. Everything was clear to him now. The spiritual sword had spent not holy power, but his spiritual power. Everything was now falling into place. It was clear why he was so weak. His supply of spiritual power was almost depleted, which is why he almost lost consciousness. It seems like it's not a good idea to use the spirit sword so often just yet. It might lead to undesirable consequences. The boy sighed heavily. He said with annoyance that they couldn't catch up with that old man now. He had run too far away. His comrade folded his arms on his chest and said that he never thought that another holy master was hiding here. But they were lucky that they decided to retreat. Xian squinted. Because of their escape, the news of the silver-striped golden snake would quickly spread. When they returned to the city, there would be a lot of rumors. It would cause a lot of problems. 311. There was a whole graveyard around the books. The bodies of the slain mercenaries were lying there, as well as the huge corpse of a golden snake. Now they would have a hard time. They would have to hide again so that these people wouldn't cause too much trouble. Yun smiled broadly. The mountain range of magical beasts was big enough to hide, and with him as their guide, they definitely wouldn't have any problems. On his chest, some strange magical symbol suddenly lit up. This magic clot flew out of the boy's chest and hung in the air. Everyone stared at it in surprise. What is this even? Yun looked at it and didn't understand anything. The main character pulled his eyes out. He had never seen something like this before. Just what is it? What kind of magic power is there? Yun's face suddenly changed, but a hysterical smile appeared on his face. He quickly apologized and said that he had to run, so it was time to say goodbye. The protagonist didn't understand anything at all. What the hell was going on here? Yun Budo didn't hear him. He said it was a secret. No one should know about it. The matter is urgent, so we need to make a deal. Suddenly, he took out a paper and a brush from somewhere. The protagonist even opened his mouth in surprise. The kid sounded like that was the way to go. The silver-striped gold snake is too big Zato, so he can have it for himself. But the protagonist must compensate him with 50,000 amethyst coins. If we add the fact that he was his guide, provided information helped in the battle, then he only owes 60,000 coins. He held out a sheet of contract to the protagonist. Xian noted that this kid makes a pretty good businessman. At this time, his comrade was smiling. He was glad that they had come to an agreement. Xian Yi had no intention of paying him. He snatched the piece of paper from his hands. Also his brother. This ring contains all his savings. He'll give the rest when he gets more money. He threw the ring into his hands and the boy gratefully accepted the gift. Yun smiled and told the protagonist not to forget his duty. Now it was time for him to go. The boy took this very magical sphere of purple color in his hands, and it began to disassemble even more. Something began to change around it. The air became liquid and viscous. A second later, if it was gone. The protagonist stood on the ground and understood nothing. He didn't even have time to say goodbye as the boy vaporized literally in the air, leaving behind him only a purple haze. Jian did not understand anything at all. He held out his hand and said, at least it was necessary to tell him how to contact him. Otherwise, how would he be able to pay him back? But it looks like this matter will remain unresolved. Xian stood beside the corpse of a huge golden snake. So what should he do with this big guy? Dragging it around on his back is obviously not an option. So what's he going to do with it here? The boy thought, by the way, the books from the academy said that if you swallow a silver-striped golden snake, you can get invulnerability to all kinds of poison. It was an incredibly useful ability. Besides, he knows the right technique. Even though there's a risk of being poisoned by the snake's venom but not leaving it here, that would be sacrilege. The guy put his hand on the snake's scales. It was cold and hard to the touch. He began to concentrate the energy in his hand, sucking out all the power in the snake. We need to finish this before the mercenaries come back with help. He concentrated harder and harder every second. Gotta feel the snake. The snake is a part of him. His hand began to glow with a purple light, indicating that the absorption had begun. The guy began to recite the spell. Let the snake become his blood and flesh so that no eater would harm him. The snake's body began to vaporize, turning into a ball of yellow energy. The protagonist began to absorb it all, but it didn't happen the way he thought it would. The absorption process was too painful. An incredible pain spread through his body, and he had to fight it somehow. Otherwise, he would just pass out. A dazzling light began to develop everywhere. One had to squeeze his eyes shut. Otherwise, the guy would risk going blind. Xian stood, but his legs began to shake from overexertion. The energy had completely left the snake and was now starting to transfer into his body. It felt like he was being pierced by 1,000 swords. Xian completely merged with this energy. His body began to burn, his skin covered with some strange, scaly growths, similar to the ones the snake was covered with. The overexertion had reached just some kind of cosmic force. This sucks. And his mouth was bleeding in a flash. If he passed out now, no one would be able to help him. The boy fell to the ground and a few drops of blood dripped from his mouth. His strength was gradually leaving him. He could feel the snake spreading through his body. His head began to ache with unbearable pain. He grabbed it. I think the snake was trying to take over, he thought. His head was splitting from the unbearable pain. His hands were suddenly transformed. Long claws instead of the usual fingers. His skin turned into scales, and a golden light began to emanate from it. Xian clenched his teeth. Fangs began to appear there. He tried his best to fight so that the snake couldn't take over his body finally, but it was just some crazy pain. His body couldn't take this kind of overload, especially after such a grueling battle. The guy's face began to transform. Fangs appeared instead of teeth, and his ears stretched out, turning into some semblance of animal ears. His eyes were white with film. If he continues like this, he will lose himself and turn into a snake eater. The guy had already almost transformed. His face deformed, that's right, he has that technique. He suddenly remembered the moment when he knocked the demon out of his older brother. He had to use it immediately, there was so much time left for me. He had already almost lost his human form. His mind gradually began to fog up, it was necessary to try his luck. At the very least, he had nothing to lose. Xian brought 2 fingers to his forehead. and began to apply the demon banishment technique. He prayed to all the gods that this technique would finally work, or else he would be finished. He would turn into a mindless monster. The spell worked. The energy began to spread out, filling the space around him. The guy didn't know what to do, but he was barely holding on. His head was almost foggy. He was on the verge of becoming a monster. But luckily the technique worked. The snake demon immediately burst out of his body. It looked like a dragon, but only without the bodily shell. 346. The spirit began to gradually dissolve into the air, leaving behind only a slight golden haze. It had all worked. Now his life was saved. Xian heavily breathing, he looked at his hand. His skin was now a normal color, his teeth had shrunk, and his eyes were clear. Great. It all worked. He thanked everyone he could for what would now remain in human form. The boy fell to the ground, breathing heavily. If the technique hadn't worked, he would have been finished by now. Absorbing the snake was much harder than he thought. His body was now completely exhausted. After being absorbed, his body now began to absorb the energy of the silver-striped golden snake, and its spirit was destroyed. He could literally physically feel his body changing. Everything had worked out, and he had now gained new abilities. The boy looked up at the sky with joy. Now we need to let the energy be assimilated so that the susceptibility becomes even higher and higher. It will take time, but the main task is already accomplished. He got to his feet. I watched. He also wanted to get out of here as soon as possible, and it wouldn't hurt to wash up. Not the most pleasant odor was coming off of him. The day was gradually coming to an end, but a large crescent moon had already emerged and began to illuminate the earth with its bright white light. Small stars had already begun to appear in the sky. Soon the mercenaries arrived at the same place. Now they were much more numerous than before. The same old man was walking in front. He was furious. He wanted to tear these two brats right here. They had interfered with him, and now they would pay with their lives. But unfortunately, he noticed that there was no one else in the place. Shit, they didn't get away. The man was left with his nose again. Suddenly, someone's soft and pleasant voice was heard from outside. The stranger said that everything had happened as expected. It would be strange if they didn't run away. In front of them stood an obscure man in strange clothes. The man looked at him in horror and asked what should they do now. The man stood in front of them and looked down from above. It was their captain. A man of tall stature dressed in luxurious clothing. He ordered his servants to set a reward for them, and tell them that besides the silver-striped golden snake, they had also killed his men. These brats won't leave this mountain range alive. A predatory smile appeared on his face. Now the protagonists had another huge problem. They are being hunted by a group of experienced mercenaries. At this time, the protagonist didn't suspect anything. His clothes were lying somewhere on the ground, and he himself plunged into the water with a loud sound. It was time to take a bath. A waterfall was rushing around, and the protagonist was splashing in the water. The water was quite cool, refreshing his whole body. The boy smiled finally. For a long time, he would be able to take a proper shower. He happily dived under the water like a fish. After absorbing the snake's energy, his senses became sharper. His sense of smell, allowed, and vision sharpened. He felt much better now. It seemed to him that he had become part of all the nature around him. The lad swam in the water and enjoyed the pleasant and coolness. He felt this sensation for the first time. The guy dove deeper. He felt himself merged with the river as one. It was like he was part of this big organism called nature. He was the river. A big ugly octopus with many eyes on its head looked at the unknown alien in surprise. He raised his tentacle upward as a sign of greeting. He saw and understood the fishes, all the sea creatures. He saw the rocks and felt them. It was as if all the living things around him had become his own. It was as if he had become part of it all. When he reached the waterfall, he threw himself down, but he was not afraid of crashing. He realized that the water would pick him up and he was in no danger. The little figure of the boy flew down with great speed. A second later, he plunged into the water. The boy opened his eyes, a blissful smile on his face. He'd never felt so good before. He could feel everything around him. Everything around him was supporting him. He cried out with joy. He is everything around him. He had finally reached this level where he could feel all of nature around him. Suddenly, he felt some strange energy. It was like a holy energy. It was much purer and lighter than normal. The boy surfaced from the water and looked around joyfully. He was overwhelmed with incredible emotions. He had not felt so full of energy. Alive, truly alive for a long time. But suddenly his gaze caught on something that made him stop. He stared forward with eyes open with surprise. The guy saw an incredibly beautiful girl who was sitting on the shore, covered only with a small light towel. The girl looked at him with surprise and interest. What was she doing here? At that moment, the guy as if fell through the ground. While he was splashing in the water, he didn't even notice that there was a girl in the river besides him. But he couldn't stop. The guy, completely naked, flew straight at her, and in a few seconds he would plunge into the water. There was fear in the girl's eyes. She saw exactly what she wasn't supposed to see. Is that its chick? The girl opened her mouth in surprise, and her cheeks immediately turned red to the extreme. Xian couldn't stop anymore. He flew into the water at full speed, and there was a sound like a bomb exploding somewhere. Splashes of water flew in different directions, and they would definitely splash the girl. After a few seconds, the protagonist jumped out of the water and waved his hands. He tried to explain everything. He asked the girl to wait. Let her not scream. The stranger looked at him with a frightened and surprised look. She probably thought he was some kind of pervert. The guy tried to explain everything. He said he didn't know there was anyone here but him. Honest. The girl didn't seem to believe it too much. She looked at him in surprise and said, "And it's just an accident, right?" The girl looked scared. Her head was swarming with many thoughts. She realized that something irreparable was about to happen. Before the guy could say a word to me, a huge boulder flew into him. Despite her appearance, the girl was incredibly strong. The stone fell into the water, and it felt as if the guy was about to be flattened. Xian flew in the opposite direction, thrown away by the blast wave. How strong this girl was, after all. He almost lost consciousness from such a strong blow. The guy hit the rocks, and now it felt like his head was turned upside down. A stone fell on the place where the protagonist had just been, splashing water. Fortunately, the protagonist was able to dodge in time and dive deeper so that the rock wouldn't flatten him. He was underwater, and held his breath as much as possible. While underwater, he pondered. This girl was around his age, but had already reached the level of a great Saint Master. This was simply amazing. The guy couldn't believe it. There were so many talented people in his academy, but no one could even come close to matching this girl. Her strength was simply staggering. The guy was floundering underwater like a frog. The air in his lungs gradually began to run out. She must have been through a lot. He'd have to explain himself to her properly, or he'd make another dangerous enemy. Oh, for crying out loud. How does he manage to get himself into these situations? But first, I had to get my things. He dived out of the water and got dressed, but the girl was gone. Where did she go? Suddenly, he heard a woman's angry voice from behind him. He turned back, already realizing who he was going to see there. What's about to happen? Another fight. The angry girl stood and held her holy sword in her hands. She looked at him as if she was ready to kill him right now. In fact, she was. Her clothes fit her perfectly, emphasizing her beautiful form. But it was too soon for the boy to admire the girl's beauty. She swung her sword, and with it, a huge jet of water rose into the sky. The first form of the Imperial Water Arts. The girl seriously intended to kill him. Not even a few seconds later, a huge water wave flew at the protagonist. The girl was really pissed off. The wave took the form of a dragon, which flew straight at the protagonist, opening its wide mouth. It was a huge effort for him to dodge such a fast attack. The water was like a blade. It cut through everything around him, even the rocks. A moment more, and the protagonist would have been cut into several pieces. Xian shouted for the girl to wait. He just wants to explain everything to her after all. The guy wasn't trying his best to prevent conflicts after all. He didn't need to have another strong enemy. But it seems like no one was listening to him. She was moving at a phenomenal speed. In a second, she was already behind the protagonist's back. Swinging her sword, she screamed, whether it was a misunderstanding or not. Peeping on a bathing girl, it's a serious crime. The guy gritted his teeth and prepared to get a big kick out of this. She moved incredibly fast. The guy was hit by a lot of blows. He couldn't dodge them, or flew all over the waterfall like some kind of ball. There were several people standing below and raising their hands up, supporting their mistress. They were shouting for her to hit him properly. There stood two men, one of whom struck the second and shouted, How did he allow such a thing to happen? That a stranger should sneak over the waterfall and approach the young mistress? Feng rubbed the bruised spot and blushed. He said that it wasn't his fault. He was following the Saint Force in the river, but this guy somehow managed to avoid his perception. The second man frowned even more. He said that he was sure it was all because of Fian's constant drinking. A look of squeamishness was reflected on his face. He got to his feet and walked forward. Feng said that perhaps all of this was true. However, when the young mistress dealt with this guy, she wouldn't complain. This guy might not turn out to be that simple, replied the other person. Feng again took out a pot of alcohol from somewhere and tipped it into his mouth. He asked, "He really thinks that this guy will be able to handle her begging sign compared to his peers? The young mistress is invincible." At this time, the fight continued. The protagonist was dodging because of all his strength, but a so-and-so girl was incredibly fast. She was cutting through the rocks with her water magic like a blade. One more move and the guy would be finished. He realized that he couldn't handle this girl one-on-one. Why does she have such power? She's still so young. Poor guy tried to shout at her. He apologized several times, but she wouldn't listen to him. The girl looked completely pissed off. She shouted that she could hear him perfectly well. Something about the way she looked didn't seem to notice it, because she was going to kill him. In fact, the girl didn't even want to hear anything. She swung her sword, sending another wave of water towards the head hero. He must die. The guy didn't have time to dodge, and a sharp jet pierced his shoulder like a blade. Blood spurted, pain spread all over the guy's body. The girl was still able to hurt him. He couldn't handle that kind of speed. At this moment, he thought, this girl is incredibly strong. If he wasn't serious, he would just die. The water had already almost collapsed his body. Now either he would drown or this girl would cut him with her blades. Xian Wu grasped his sword. Well, if the girl wants to fight in earnest, that's how it could be. Now the guy will show off all his strength. Literally a few centimeters away from the girl's face flew a magic jet. She looked at it with horror. The girl didn't expect that this stranger could show her such resistance. Fear for her life flashed in the girl's eyes for a second. Xian sprang high into the air and swung his sword. The girl dodged it with her last strength, but still, the main character's attack reached her body. The girl cried out in pain and surprise. She flew straight down. The guy rushed after her, holding his sword at the ready. The girl gritted her teeth. She wasn't ready to give up. But at the same time, she didn't expect that this no acquaintance would be so strong. 410, after flying a few dozen meters, the two of them slammed into the water with great force. There was a loud splash. Water mixed with vapor flew in all directions. The energy was unbelievably strong. Xian jumped out of the water and stood on the ground completely wet. He was breathing heavily and holding his sword in his hands. He tried his best to explain himself to the girl. The guy breathing heavily said he wasn't arguing with her. She may be stronger than him, but she lacks real experience. What just happened was just a misunderstanding. He apologized and asked her to stop fighting, otherwise. The guy was silent for a second. A girl of such insolence. Otherwise, what, he dares to threaten her? The girl tensed her whole body, and it seemed that the very air near her began to vibrate. Her face became incredibly angry. She was not only offended that she had been peeped at, but also that this impudent man was now daring to threaten her. She sprang to her feet high into the air in one swift leap. She was followed by a tail of magical energy. The guy definitely didn't expect this. It seemed to be a special battle technique. For a second, fear flashed in his eyes. This was something he definitely didn't expect. The guy looked at her and didn't know what to do. He realized that now the girl would just kill him. He had to concentrate. He didn't want to fight her. But there seemed to be no other way out. They stood opposite each other and glared at each other. The girl looked at him with a surprised look. He was able to get her to use a fighting technique. He's definitely an unusual pervert. The guy stood a little far away, her head released, but the girl had no intention of backing down. She raised her hand once again and activated her battle sword. However, this pervert wouldn't leave here alive. The sword stabbed into the ground with tremendous force. A water vortex began to form around it. Something terrible was about to happen. The girl was getting really angry. It had to stop or they would just kill each other. Water pillars began to form all around. The ball stand was stuck in the ground and water was splashing around it. They will definitely kill each other. The dragon reappeared from the water, roared, and lunged at its prey. What's the matter? Why can't we just talk? Are all women like that? Xian finally lost his temper. Finally. At least someone will fight back against that little brat. He looked at her menacingly and said that he was going to let her go. But since she's so ungrateful, she's going to get punched in the face now. He didn't want to do this until the last minute, but it seems he was left with no choice. He'd have to get a little rough. The guy got into a fighting stance and began to accumulate energy. Xian released a beam of purple energy in her direction, which immediately began to split the water that was flying at him. The water dragon that was summoned to kill him disintegrated into many droplets. It was powerless in front of this technique. Now a jet of electricity shot straight at the girl. Now she was seriously scared for her life. She wouldn't be able to dodge now. This spell would just destroy her. But at the last moment, literally, if out of nowhere appeared someone's hand, and with a flick of the sword that flew straight at the girl. It was almost a few centimeters from her face, but the stranger came up in time. It was the same old man who stood at the foot of the waterfall and watched the girl. He had only a slight snap of his fingers to repel such a powerful attack. Xian's eyes bulged out in surprise. This old man was strong. He would definitely not be able to handle him. The old man frowned and asked in a formidable voice, "How dare this rascal injure Madam?" The old man was furious. It seemed like he would just destroy the protagonist right now. Looks like those two were the bodyguards of that girl. A second later, Feng appeared behind the boy's back. His face was as red from alcohol as ever. With his toothless mouth, he said that it was a great technique, but still not enough. The guy turned around in surprise and frightened. He didn't expect this old man to appear behind his back. When did he have time to move so quickly? Feng was furious, he shouted. How dare this little asshole peep on a young girl? Now he would destroy him. The old man swung and his fist was filled with magical energy. Naturally, the protagonist wouldn't have time to dodge. The fist hit exactly on target, his case riddled with incredible pain. Hit so hard that the guy flew several meters into the air. His breath hitched, and his heart seemed to skip a beat. A second later, a trickle of blood came out of his mouth. The old man was incredibly strong. The guy couldn't do anything, not even react. Now it was hard for him to breathe because of such a blow. He's definitely dead. Why can't we just have a normal conversation? Is it that hard? Xian flew upwards and slid down the waterfall in the opposite direction. The impact was incredibly strong. The guy ended up high in the sky, soaring like a bird. I wonder if he'll even live. The poor guy was flying upwards and he couldn't feel his body. The speed was so great that he could hardly breathe. It seemed he was going to lose consciousness and go to his ancestors. Too bad for the kid. Feng rejoiced at his blow. He shouted and the girl clapped her hands and said that her uncle was very cool. At this time, the poor protagonist was lying somewhere in the bushes. He could hardly feel his body. His mouth was bleeding. He was breathing heavily, and too could come to his senses. Feng smiled with his mouth in which the teeth grew not in a row but in. The man said that this guy took a direct hit from him and managed to survive. Yeah, that's a pretty capable kid. The man looked away in surprise. What? This guy's still able to move? Suddenly, the man felt a strange sensation throughout his body. It was as if he stopped moving. His body stiffened and he couldn't move a finger. The girl shouted for her uncle to kill that impertinent man. She couldn't bear such humiliation, but the uncle told her to calm down. The kid is seriously hurt, so he thinks he's had enough. Besides, it wasn't his policy to kill children. The girl couldn't get over it. That creep was watching her. She can't just let him go. Soon another man approached him. He told the girl that they had important things to do. If those people caught up with them, it would become a big problem. The girl looked frightened at her uncle. Feng again continued to whip alcohol from his throat. Few seconds later, a dragon landed on the ground beside them. This, in all likelihood, was their transportation. Some distance away from them lay the protagonist, the ground beneath him sagging from such a forceful impact. His mouth was bleeding. The guy was still unconscious and barely breathing. The girl standing on the dragon's back looked down at him with disgust. She turned to him one last time and squeamishly said that now he would just lie there and die. The dragon flapped its wings a few times and flew upwards. The protagonist was left all alone. Thank God those crazy people flew away. Now all he had to do was come to his senses. The dragon disappeared through the forest. A few stars lit up in the sky, a few of them fell. There someone didn't have time to make a wish. The dragon swiftly flew away somewhere far away. into the night sky, where dawn was already beginning to break on the horizon. Two men were sitting on the dragon. One of them was drinking alcohol as usual. The older one, I asked what was wrong with that guy. Feng laughed and asked why he thought that. The princess sat between them and looked at one and the other with an uncomprehending look. The man replied that he had known him for years of you. Does he think he can hide anything from him? The girl, frightened and surprised, asked her uncles, "What are they talking about?" It seems that they are not telling her something. Feng showed his hand and said that the moment he hit that kid, he cut him in the palm of his hand. And he has no idea how this kid couldn't do it. Does he really move with that kind of speed? The girl didn't understand anything. This damn pervert is weaker than her, but he was able to hurt her uncle. Uncle Yun asked, how could a guy who had only recently become a saint be able to injure him? Speaking of which, his weapon was quite strange and he could control it from a distance. And there was also one other strange thing. The man hesitated and furrowed his eyebrows. On top of all that, this little brat was able to escape his perception of the holy power and get closer to the mistress. Feng frowned and began to speak. He's afraid that this guy's origin isn't that simple and there might be a huge power behind him, so he decided to let him go. It might not be that simple with him. The man frowned. The girl squeamishly hummed. She didn't like hearing that. And what power could compare to their clan? Her uncle is too kind and speaks too well of a scum like this guy. Yun frowned again. Madam, let her not be so rude. Right now, they're not going through the best of times, so they can't afford to create new enemies. The girl showed him her tongue and her middle finger. Well, that's fine. It wasn't much of a stretch to say I don't know, but it was as if the man saw everything. He immediately turned around and the girl showed another gesture. Okay, she understood everything. The girl was really scared, and her uncle was an incredibly strong man, and to cross him was like death. The girl sighed heavily. Just a little more and the unmentionable would happen. She greatly feared and respected her uncle. I didn't want him to be angry with her. The girl turned back for the last time. It was a pity she couldn't finish him off in person. A small annoyance had now settled in her soul, but nothing. She would surely get even with him. They were getting farther and farther away from this place. The girl thought that this pervert would not be able to survive such a wound after all. Life continued to go on as usual. Huge masses of water continued to fall down, dissolving into the river. The protagonist was lying on the ground and was barely trying to catch his breath. His whole body ached unbearably after being hit so hard. He closed his eyes and tried to regain consciousness. Damn it, the injury was too serious. He can't even move. It looks like this old man broke him into silver. If it wasn't for the sword technique, this was the end of him. Who the hell is that old man? Where did he get such strength from? The guy remembered how this stranger had drained all the spirit out of him with one blow. At that moment, the boy thought he was finished. The protagonist grasped his chest and felt his heart beating. If it wasn't for his technique at that moment, the blow could have been fatal. He still had the picture of the fight in front of his eyes. It made him feel cold inside. He angrily clenched his fists, although he didn't die immediately, but now he only had to wait for his death. His body had become so weak that even breathing was difficult for him. The most frustrating thing was that there was no one around. No one could help him or even finish him off, except he didn't want to die right after he could have gotten stronger. It just wasn't fair. So much energy. What is it? Suddenly he felt an incredible amount of energy spreading through his body, filling in all the gaps. Incomprehensible images began to pop up in front of his eyes. They were immediately blurred. The guy could not focus his eyes. It was like some form of holy power. Exactly. Could it be that after his perception was enhanced, he could see something new? That holy power looked very familiar. The guy felt something. He remembered something long forgotten, something he had left from his past life. From the surprise and realization of everything, he opened his eyes as wide as he could. He remembered. It was the same light. It looked exactly like his mother's holy power. His memory flashed back to his childhood, when his mother had treated him with the exact same magic. Light Saint Force Masters are able to heal by drawing on the energy of their surroundings. If he could use it, it was possible and he would be able to heal his wounds. In any case, it was worth a try. He has nothing to lose. If he succeeds, he can survive. It's better than waiting to die. He touched one clot of holy power that was flying nearby, and as soon as he did, a pleasant chill began to spread through his body. It filled all his veins, all his veins. It seemed as if he was reborn anew. The boy opened his eyes wide. He was surprised. The feeling was so familiar that he had a pleasant pinch in his chest. Finally, he would be able to heal. While the protagonist was struggling to heal himself, several unknown dragon-like creatures were hovering in the sky. They came closer and closer, and riding on top of the dragons sat a man. The monsters flew, flapping their huge wings. Their riders were dressed in dark clothes, almost completely hiding their bodies and faces. A man, apparently the most important of them, ordered all the others to pursue them. "It doesn't matter who's out there, we have to kill them all." His face looked incredibly cruel. It had a predatory smile on it like some kind of beast. Several flying dragons approached the foot of the waterfall. The water was noisy, and fell with a rumbling crash onto the ones lying down to me, merging the rest of the river. The men began to jump off their animals, and with quick steps head forward. Only their vague silhouettes were visible. No eyes, no physique could be discerned. You couldn't even tell if they were men or women. They walked backwards and forwards here, examining every pebble. But it looked like they were too late. There was no one here, no matter how many times they looked. At this time, the protagonist was hiding deep under the water, holding his breath as best he could. From beneath the thickness of the water that concealed him, he watched the vague silhouettes that wandered along the shore and seemed to be sniffing for something. There were only muffled voices, but apparently there were several men. The boy listened. No good intentions from these guys, but luckily, he had learned to dissolve his holy power into his surroundings. Otherwise, things could have ended very badly for him. Now that it's here, these people won't be able to find him. Suddenly, the man swung his hand as if he had thrown something straight into the waterfall. A huge boulder flew right there, splitting the water, and crashed into the wall with a crash. The rocks flew down and began to fall into the water with a noise, but there was nothing there, except the stones and the water. The people continued to stand on the hillside and watched intently. The ringleader finally made sure that there was nothing at all here, nothing much in the water either. It looked like they had indeed escaped. The man in a loud and gruff voice ordered everyone else to set off in pursuit. Everyone else obeyed him, and quickly jumped on their riding animals. The griffins flapped their wings a few times, and in a second they were already high in the sky, rising above the cliffs. Xian lay deep under the water and smirking watched all of this. He was incredibly curious. It was good that he was in a stable state, and they hadn't noticed him. All around him was just water and rocks, with the occasional small fish swimming by. But to his horror, he saw that something black and very big like a stone was approaching him. The boy's eyes bulged with fright, and he began to gasp with fear. He wanted to breathe, but his ribs cracked, and he felt an unbearable pain all over his chest. There was less and less air left, and the wave was about to crash over him. He could no longer stay underwater for such a long time. A huge rock fell right a few meters away from him. The poor guy couldn't take it after all and opened his mouth to let out air bubbles. What a devil. He moved too much and his mouth opened up again early. That really sucks. If he keeps this up, he'll just choke on the water. The thicker water was hiding him securely, but it looked like it was about to become his grave. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. He didn't think his life would end in such a ridiculous way. He became incredibly resentful of his indiscretion. He began to faint. His eyes slowly opened, and the first thing he saw in front of him was the beautiful faces of the girls who were looking at him worriedly with their big eyes. Xian tried to come to his senses. He opened his eyes and he couldn't believe them. This couldn't be true. This was just a dream. His whole body ached. Realization slowly came. The beautiful girls screamed in fright. "Master, he's finally awake." Could it be that he had fallen into every guy's wet dream? The guy started dreaming to himself. Suddenly, it was as if some invisible voice ordered him to wake up immediately. The guy immediately opened his eyes. What he saw he did not like at all. There were no beautiful girls in front of him. In front of him was the face of an old man, smirking evilly. There were several other bandits there. A horrible guess pierced his head. He had been found after all. What a devil, who the hell are they? The guy jumped to the ground in horror and instantly came to his senses. The men began to talk to each other. One of them said they heard loud noises nearby, and when they went to check, they found him. Who was he? Why was he drowning? What happened out there? Was he caught in the act during the Battle of the Holy Masters? The other man ordered him to be quiet. This I'm not yet fully recovered. Xian realized that it was his older brother's fault with his lewd books. The guy jumped up on the ground and stood up, shaking himself off. A man said that his buddy was too talkative. Let him ignore him. Xiao Dao shrieked resentfully. Hey, he's just talking a little more than usual. The third fat man turned to the protagonist. So what happened to him? His injury looks very serious. The guy rubbed his bruised head. He said he dived into the water to catch some fish. And then something happened overhead and a bunch of rocks fell on him. They hit him and he began to sink. Soon they came to the bottom of the waterfall where it all happened. It looks like the Holy Masters really fought here, so the waterfall looks different now. Indeed, the waterfall had changed its course, and now a large boulder stood in the middle of it. The protagonist noticed it too. Completely destroyed. Who were those people? They had something to do with that girl begging sign. The case was taking an interesting turn. Xiao Dao couldn't hold himself back. He turned to the main character. Brother, what's his name? Doesn't he want to join the fire mercenaries? Even though there are only 3 people in their group, in the future, they will definitely become the strongest mercenary group in the entire Blue Wind Kingdom. The boy looked at him with disbelief. Fire mercenaries. He had never heard of them before. The mustachioed man covered his mouth and told the protagonist to ignore it and not to worry. His friend was just kidding. The fat man was supportive. He said the guy could think he was fucked up and talking complete bullshit. Xian continued to stare thoughtfully into the distance. They don't look like the bad guys. He's still injured and doesn't know where he is at this moment at all, so joining them isn't such a bad idea. Besides, what do you have to lose? Xian approached them, and good-naturedly said that he had nowhere to go, so if they didn't mind taking him in, that would be great. The men were surprised, right? Brother is really sure? Xiao Dao almost went crazy with joy. He was glad that the strength of the fire mercenaries grows, tell them by the day. The mustachioed man looked at the protagonist and said that his name was Kendall, and he was the head of the fire mercenaries. Indeed, the man's eyes were not the same as those of the native Chinese. The fat man also introduced himself. His name was Hu Po, and he holds the position of vice leader. The man folded his hands in a gesture of prayer, looking a little comical. The last to introduce himself was a man with long yellow hair who said cheerfully that his name was Xiao Dao, and he was the current leader of the fire mercenaries. The boy also smiled and introduced himself. He said that his name was Wu Jiangchen. Kendall smiled good-naturedly and said that he was now a member of the fire mercenaries. Welcome. Xiao Dao was incredibly happy. He said that this guy would now be the vice leader. Hu Po resentfully looked in his direction. Hu Po said that guy looks much more trustworthy than Xiao Dao. Let them give the post of acting leader to him. The guy got angry. He has more experience, so he should be the leader. Kendall said, since that's the case, this new guy will be the second vice leader. They started bickering amongst themselves, and the main character laughed heartily. These guys didn't look bad. Besides, they were cute and even funny. Joining their group wasn't such a bad decision. The boy thought about it. These guys reminded him of his allies from the past world when he first gathered their group. He was asked if he became a leader in the future. Could they become vice leaders? Someone replied not to even dream. I guess he's the one who can do it. Even those very voices surfaced in his memory. He remembered all the moments from his past life when he was gathering his past group, and his companions were as shibur like these guys. However, he must not forget his ultimate goal. He must find the lonely old man, to find out the truth about his rebirth and return to his clan as soon as possible. He's already tried in this world for a ridiculously long time, Kendall said loudly to celebrate a new member joining their group. We should head to the mercenary market. Everyone agreed it was a great idea. The boy wondered, a mercenary market? He had heard of this place but had never been there. Well, that would be interesting. The mercenary market looked rather strange. The structures there were unusual, more like large beehives. Birds were flying everywhere. Some strange things like big balloons were floating in the air. This place was unusual. The main character was here for the first time. He took a full breath and looked around better. This place was simply huge. A satisfied smile appeared on his face. He seemed to be enjoying himself here, but he shouldn't let his guard down. Kendall was in a good mood, he said loudly. Welcome to the mercenary market. Originally, this place was where mercenaries exchanged loot, and only much later did it become an actual market. The protagonist said admiringly that he never thought it would be so lively on the mountain. The mustachioed man wondered he saw something there in the distance. As soon as the protagonist looked there, his jaw dropped. Oh no, shit. This is getting worse and worse. Damn it. It was the main character who was on the bulletin board. Xiao Dao looks exactly like their recruit. Pretty similar, it says here that 2 people killed a second-class silver-striped gold snake. Kendall was simply shocked. He couldn't believe his eyes, but only holy masters were capable of this. Jian screamed, "This sucks." He didn't think the news would spread so quickly. Gotta trick these guys somehow. He called out to them, he said. What had only recently become ordinary light? How could he kill a silver-striped gold snake? Suddenly they looked at him as if they wanted to tear him apart right now. What greedy eyes these people had. The guys looked at the protagonist with contemptuous glances for a few more moments. They didn't quite seem to trust him, but things got around here. They began to say that a holy master capable of such a thing would definitely not have drowned you. It's just someone very similar to this guy. The protagonist sighed heavily. It was a close call, but he was blown away. Xiao Dao said that it would be great if such a master joined them. The protagonist realized that it looked like he was able to fool them. Yes, it was basically not such a difficult task. These guys clearly didn't have much brains. Kendall meaningfully raised his finger up and advised the protagonist to disguise himself differently, or people will think that he is the guy who hangs on the bulletin board. The protagonist threw a hood over himself and thanked the mustached man for his advice. And now it's time to spend the money. Their eyes lit up with lust for fun. It was obvious that these guys really liked to have fun. Hu Po was the only one who tried to think rationally. They're just going to waste it again. But no one seemed to listen to his voice of sanity. They started buying stuff because it was free money. They were very fond of spending it. They bought everything they could get their hands on. There were a few books on the shelf. The salesman was calling out to his customers. Buy one. Get the second one as a gift. Unbelievable, what wonderful discounts of 50% off on everything. There were many delicious dishes of freshly cooked animal meat in the store. The mere sight of it already made me drool. Xiao Dao looked at the leader and said that he had saved up so much money, and now he could buy something for his sister and Mira. The man blurted out a smile. It's already been half a year since he's been home. Doesn't even know if his daughter will call him father. He turned around and told the protagonist to buy whatever he wanted. If he didn't have enough money, he could add more. The guy thanked them, but he doesn't need anything. Xiao Dao even cried a little. The leader is too biased. He never lends him any money. Hu Po was holding a few loaves of bread and a piece of meat. He said that if you gave him money, he would blow it on food. What a talker. The leader said Fatty is right. He will never give Xiao Dao money. They are so friendly. The guy went behind and watched their cheerful company. Looking at these people, he himself was getting warm at heart. Suddenly, he felt a strange sensation in his whole body, as if his body began to be pierced by lightning. It felt like he was summoning a weapon. He didn't do that. The guy looked at his hand in surprise, which was already concentrating magic. Why did his sword awaken by itself? Something seemed strange to him. It seemed as if it was happy. The guy opened his eyes in surprise. This energy has its own consciousness. How is that even possible? Soon they came to a market where there were many animals and a variety of goods. Could it be that the energy was attracted by something nearby? He approached a shop with a strange vendor who was selling some trinkets. The vendor looked strange, and he was wearing some fancy clothes, sitting in a lotus posture and looked more like some kind of frog. The man seemed to be asleep, for from under his hat came an audible snore.